Well, hello there. I am glad you found this quiet little corner of the internet tonight wherever you are tucked in. Pull the blanket up a little higher. Get comfortable, because tonight we are stepping into a world where something as small as who sat beside you in a carriage could end your entire future. Picture a young woman trusted, admired, respected by nearly everyone at court, suddenly accused of a sin she had never committed. Forced to defend her own body in the cruelest way a royal doctor could think of, and by the time the truth finally came out, it no longer mattered. Tonight we uncover the rule so small, so easy to miss, that breaking it even by accident could quietly end a lady's reputation, and in this case, her life. Now before we step into her story, let's get settled together, shall we? If stories like this one pull you in the way, they pull me in a quick like helps more than you might think, and tapping that subscribe button means you will not miss the next chapter of this world we are slowly building together. And I always love hearing from you down in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? Which city, which quiet room, which little pocket of the world? Tell me. And if this story finds its way into your heart even a little, let me know that too. All right, dim the lights if you can let a soft fan hum somewhere in the background, and let's begin. Here is the thing about Victorian England that nobody tells you in school. It was not really governed by laws alone. It was governed by an invisible rule book, one written nowhere on paper, yet somehow known by everyone in every drawing room from London to the smallest country estate. A rule book about how to greet a stranger, how to fold a letter, how long to grieve, how many times you were allowed to dance with the same man at a party. Break one of those unspoken rules even by accident, and you could lose something far harder to win back than a fortune. You could lose the one thing a Victorian woman was taught to guard above all else, her good name. Over the next several stories tonight, we're going to walk through 10 of those rules one at a time through the real women whose lives were quietly shaped and sometimes shattered by them. But we start with the rule that could ruin a woman before she'd done anything wrong at all. It is January 1839. Kensington Palace, England is not the grand glittering court you might picture in your head. It is smaller than that, more tense than that. Full of hallways where conversation drops the moment someone new walks in. At the centre of our story tonight is a woman named Flora Hastings. She is 33 years old, sharp-witted, deeply respected, a trusted lady of the bedchamber, to the Duchess of Kent, mother of the young Queen. People at court like her. They ask for her opinion. They save her a seat at dinner. In a world built almost entirely on reputation, Flora Hastings has one of the finest reputations a woman could ask for, and that is exactly what makes what happens next so hard to watch. Just after Christmas, Flora had travelled from her family home in Scotland back down to London. It was a long journey, days on end, uncomfortable roads, freezing air pressing through the carriage windows, the kind of trip that left a person stiff and worn out long before reaching home. The lady who was meant to travel with her as a proper chaperone was not able to make the trip. So for part of the way, Flora simply shared her carriage with a man named John Conroy, the Duchess of Kent's private comptroller, a man who managed the household's money and its politics in equal measure. To Flora, it was nothing more than a practical solution to an ordinary travel problem. She had known the man for years. There was nothing hidden, nothing improper, not even the smallest flicker of romance between them. Now here is where we need to pause for a moment, because if you were watching a film of this story, this would be the moment the music quietly shifts. There was an unwritten rule sitting underneath every single social interaction in Victorian England, one so deeply understood that almost nobody bothered to say it out loud. A respectable lady was never under any circumstance to be alone in the company of a man who was not her husband, her father, or her brother. It did not matter if nothing happened. It did not matter if the arrangement was purely practical, born from a shortage of chaperones and a long road home. The rule was never really about what actually took place inside that carriage. The rule was about what other people were free to imagine had taken place inside it. And in the world Flora Hastings lived in, imagination could be more dangerous than truth. Word of the shared carriage ride spread through the palace the way gossip spreads through every tight-knit community in human history, quietly then all at once. If Victorian England had group chats, this particular rumour would have broken every single server in the building, and it landed in a household already thick with old resentment. The young Queen, only 19 years old at the time, deeply distrusted John Conroy. He had spent years controlling her childhood under a strict set of household rules. Her own mother had agreed to something historians now call the Kensington system. Victoria despised him, and by association she was more than ready to believe the worst about anyone standing too near him. Then something happened that gave the whispers a shape they could hold on to. Flora began complaining of pain and nausea, and her stomach had visibly begun to swell. In a palace already primed to believe the worst, that single detail was gasoline on a fire that had already been lit. Two women deeply trusted by the Queen, her governess Baroness Letson, and a lady named Lady Tavistock, were the ones who first carried the suspicion straight to Victoria's ear. Small talk over needlework turned into something sharper. Fans lifted just a little higher than usual at dinner, hiding smiles that were not kind, and hallway conversations grew quiet the moment Flora stepped into a room, only to pick back up in whispers the moment she stepped back out again. By the time the rumour reached Queen Victoria's own diary, it had hardened into something like certainty. She put her suspicions into words in her own hand, convinced that her mother's household was hiding a scandal that needed to be dragged out into daylight. I want you to sit with that for a second. A grown woman's entire reputation quietly taken apart over dinner, one glance at a time, long before anyone had bothered to ask her a single honest question. Eventually someone did ask, but not gently. In the middle of February, Flora was brought before Sir James Clark, the royal physician, and told in no uncertain terms that the only way to end the rumours was to submit to a physical examination that would prove once and for all whether she was carrying a child. She refused at first. Days passed. The pressure did not let up, and finally worn down she agreed. Picture the room for a moment. Cold light through tall windows, the quiet rustle of stiff fabric. Two doctors and one of the Queen's own ladies standing as a witness so that no one could later claim the whole affair had been improperly handled. A woman who had done nothing wrong, forced to defend her own body in front of near strangers, simply because a carriage ride had been misread by people who'd already decided what they wanted to believe. Flora would later describe the whole ordeal as rough and painful, and say she'd been treated as guilty long before anyone gave her the chance to prove otherwise. Try to imagine sitting in that chair knowing every person outside the door already has an opinion about your body, your character, your entire future, and not one of them has bothered to simply ask you first. The examination confirmed what Flora had said all along. There were no grounds whatsoever for believing a pregnancy existed or ever had. In the medical language of the time, the doctors even certified that she was biologically still a virgin. You would think that might be the end of it. A relief, an apology, a quiet return to normal life. It was not. Flora's own brother, the Marquis of Hastings, was furious on her behalf. He was so angry, in fact, that he reportedly challenged Sir James Clark to a duel over the whole affair, demanding satisfaction for the insult done to his sister's name. And soon the story stopped being a private court matter altogether. The Hastings family took their case straight to the newspapers, naming names, publishing letters, insisting the Queen's own household owed Flora a public apology. All of London began reading about it over breakfast. For a while it actually worked in Flora's favour. When she appeared in public that spring, crowds who had followed her story in the papers greeted her with warmth and sympathy instead of suspicion. But underneath the swelling that had started the entire rumour, something far more serious had been growing all along, something nobody had thought to look for once everyone became so certain they already knew the answer. Flora Hastings was sick, seriously sick, with a tumour pressing against her liver, slowly poisoning the rest of her body, while an entire palace argued about her reputation instead of her health. By the end of June, she was fading fast. Queen Victoria herself visited her sick room that summer, and by most accounts was deeply shaken by what she found. The proud, sharp-witted woman from a few months earlier had grown thin and pale beyond recognition, her hands barely strong enough to hold a teacup. Some kind of peace was made between them in that quiet room, gentle, and a little too late, the sort of apology that arrives long after the damage is already done. Flora Hastings died in the early hours of July the 5th, 1839, at just 33 years old. At her own request made before she passed, doctors performed a post-mortem examination, specifically so the truth could finally be settled beyond any argument. They found the tumour, large advance wrapped around her liver. It had been there long before anyone in that palace ever whispered the word pregnant. Here is the part of the story that still surprises people today. Public opinion turned hard and fast against the young queen. As Victoria rode through London that summer, crowds openly hissed and booed at her carriage. Men who would normally lift their hats out of respect simply refused to do it. At one public event, onlookers even shouted out Mrs. Melbourne as she passed, mocking how completely she seemed to be led by her Prime Minister's opinions rather than her own judgment. It was by most historians' accounts one of the first real dents in Victoria's early popularity. A queen barely out of her teenage years learning in the harshest way possible just how fast public trust can turn on a single misjudged moment. So let's step back from the palace for a second and just sit with what actually happened here. Nobody broke any written law. There was no crime, no real secret, nothing scandalous underneath it all. A woman shared a carriage with a man who was not her husband because the road was long and the alternatives were few. That is the entire offence. And yet that one detail, small enough to seem harmless to almost anyone listening tonight, was enough to trigger months of suspicion, a humiliating physical exam, and whispers that never really stopped until the day she died. That was the weight etiquette carried in Victorian England. It was never just about which fork to use or how to properly greet someone on the street. At its heart, it was a system for deciding who got to keep their reputation and who did not. And women more often than not were the ones who paid full price for even the smallest, most innocent slip. I think that is worth sitting with for a moment wherever you are tonight. How something so ordinary, a shared ride home on a cold winter road, could quietly rewrite the entire ending of somebody's life. It is easy to hear a story like this and think, well, that could never happen now. But if you have ever watched a rumour spread online before anyone bothered to check if it was even true, you already know the feeling Flora Hastings carried with her for months. The carriages have changed. The fans and the calling cards are long gone. But the speed at which people decide who you are, often without ever asking you directly, has not really slowed down at all. But Flora Hastings' story is only the beginning of what we're exploring together tonight. Because if a carriage ride could cause that much damage, imagine what happened when a woman got something even smaller wrong. Something as simple as a folded piece of paper left at the wrong door at the wrong hour of the afternoon. That is exactly where we are headed next. That folded piece of paper we mentioned a moment ago was not just paper, by the way. It was practically a passport, and if you did not know how to use it properly, doors all over the city could quietly shut on you without a single unkind word ever being spoken out loud. Here is a promise before we go any further. By the end of this next story, you're going to understand why one of the wealthiest women in American history once had to trick the most powerful hostess in New York into knocking on her own front door just to be let in from the cold. But let's build the world first, because you need to understand the weight this little piece of paper carried before the story will make any sense at all. In Victorian England, a proper lady did not simply show up at a friend's house because she felt like a chat over tea. That would have been considered almost shockingly forward. Instead, visiting was treated the way a small nation might treat foreign diplomacy, full of protocol, timing, and quiet signals that everyone was expected to already understand. The calling card itself was small, plain, usually printed with nothing more than a name, sometimes an address, tucked in the corner. No decoration, no flourish. Anything too fancy suggested you were trying too hard, which in this world was its own kind of crime. Visiting hours were strict. Generally speaking, a lady called between 2 and 5 in the afternoon, never earlier, never later, and definitely never on a Sunday, which was reserved for family and quiet reflection. Arrive outside that window, and you were not seen as eager. You were seen as someone who simply did not know the rules, which at that point in history was practically the same thing as admitting you did not belong. Now here is where it gets clever and honestly a little bit sneaky. When you arrived at someone's home, you did not necessarily expect to be let inside. A servant would answer the door, take your card on a small silver tray, and disappear to ask whether the lady of the house was, quote, at home. This was a wonderfully polite fiction. The lady might be sitting 10 feet away in the parlour, perfectly healthy, perfectly free. But if she did not feel like receiving visitors that day, or did not feel like receiving you specifically, the servant would simply return and say she was not at home. Everyone involved understood exactly what that meant. Nobody was fooled, and nobody was allowed to be offended, at least not out loud. Even the card itself carried hidden instructions folded like a tiny paper telegram. Turn down the top right corner, and you were announcing that you had delivered the card yourself in person, rather than sending it by a servant, a small gesture of extra respect. A corner folded on the left could mean congratulations. A card with a plain black border meant a visit of condolence and etiquette. Books were extremely specific that only the nearest family and the dearest of friends were permitted to call in person after a death. Everyone else was expected to simply leave a card and go quietly on their way. And if a family was leaving town for good, moving away permanently, they would send around a card marked with 4 small letters borrowed from French, a polite way of saying, in effect, I have come to say goodbye, and this is likely the last you will hear from me. Plenty of established hostesses made the whole system a little easier by choosing a single fixed afternoon each week as their official day at home. Tuesday perhaps, or Thursday. Everyone in her circle simply knew without ever needing to ask that Thursday was the day to call on her. It saved a great deal of guesswork, and honestly it strikes me as one of the more sensible parts of this whole elaborate dance. Gentlemen played a slightly different version of the same game, and it is worth pausing on the difference for a moment. A man could leave his own card for the head of a household without necessarily expecting or even wanting to be invited inside. His card alone was enough to say, I thought of you, I respect this household, and I have marked that respect on paper. Women rarely had that luxury. A lady's call was almost always expected to be personal, face-to-face, conducted entirely within those narrow, carefully watched afternoon hours, which meant in practice that the entire weight of this ritual, all the risk of getting it wrong, fell far more heavily on women than it ever did on the men walking beside them. And here is the detail I personally find the most fascinating out of everything in this entire ritual. There was an unspoken rule about who got to call on whom first. If you were new to a neighbourhood, new to a title, new to money, or simply lower on the social ladder than the family you wished to know, you were never under any circumstance permitted to call on them first. You had to wait. The established family held all the power, and they alone decided whether to extend the first card. Showing up uninvited to introduce yourself to someone above your station was not seen as confident. It was seen as embarrassing for you, and for everyone who had to watch you do it. Which brings us across an entire ocean to a story I think you are going to enjoy. By the 1880s, wealthy Americans had imported this exact British ritual, calling cards, visiting hours, silver trays and all, and in some ways made it even more ruthless. New York City, during what people now call the Gilded Age, had its own uncrowned queen of society, a woman named Caroline Astor, known to absolutely everyone simply as Mrs. Astor. Alongside a self-appointed social advisor named Ward McAllister, she kept something that became famous across the entire country, a list of exactly 400 people considered worthy of true high society. If your name was not on that list in the eyes of New York's oldest families, you did not really exist socially, no matter how large your bank account happened to be. People used to say, only half joking, that the number 400 was chosen for a wonderfully petty reason. It was supposedly the exact number of guests who could comfortably fit inside Mrs. Astor's own ballroom. If you did not fit in that room, socially speaking, you simply did not fit anywhere that mattered. And here is where our other family enters the story. The Vanderbilts had money, an almost unbelievable amount of it built on railroads and shipping. But money alone did not open doors in this world, not automatically. Mrs. Astor considered the Vanderbilts new, loud, and entirely too fond of showing off their wealth. And because of that unspoken rule we just talked about, the one where the older family always calls first, Mrs. Astor had simply never left her card at the Vanderbilt home. Which meant, as far as society was concerned, the Vanderbilts officially did not exist. Enter Alva Vanderbilt, a woman who I have to say might be one of my personal favourite figures in this entire era, because she understood something Mrs. Astor did not expect from her. She understood the rules well enough to use them as a weapon. In the spring of 1883, Alva planned an enormous costume ball to celebrate the opening of her brand new mansion on Fifth Avenue, a house so grand it took up almost an entire city block. The party alone was reported to cost somewhere near $250,000, an almost unthinkable figure for a single evening, with a small fortune spent on champagne and on fresh flowers shipped in just for the occasion. Newspapers across the entire country covered it, like a national event describing every gown, every borrowed jewel in loving detail. Alva sent out invitations to nearly every notable family in New York, except one. Mrs. Astor's own teenage daughter, Carrie, was left off the guest list entirely. Now Carrie had been practicing dance routines with her friends for weeks, fully expecting to attend the way every other girl of her social standing already had been invited to attend. She had rehearsed a quadrille specifically for the evening, the kind of dance that required a full set of partners who had all agreed weeks in advance. When the other girls' invitations arrived one by one and hers simply never did, she was heartbroken, and quite publicly so. This was not some small private disappointment either. In a world this size, everybody's mother heard about it within a day or two, which was of course exactly the point. Here is the trap Alva had built, and it is a truly brilliant one. Alva could not invite the Astors because officially under the very rules Mrs. Astor herself enforced on everyone else, the two families had never been properly introduced. Mrs. Astor had never called, which meant Alva had no social permission to send an invitation in the first place. So Mrs. Astor, the single most powerful woman in New York society, was left with an impossible choice, and I imagine it must have cost her a sleepless night or two. She could either watch her own daughter be publicly humiliated and left out of the one party the entire city could not stop talking about, or she could personally do the one thing she had refused to do for years, swallow her own pride and send her card to the Vanderbilt mansion, first formally welcoming a family she had spent years quietly looking down upon. She chose her daughter, of course. Mrs. Astor's carriage arrived at the Vanderbilt home her card was left with the servant at the door, and within a day an invitation for young Carrie arrived at the Astor mansion. The story goes that when the two women were later seen speaking at the ball itself quite warmly by most accounts, Mrs. Astor reportedly admitted that the country had grown too large and too wealthy to keep families like the Vanderbilts locked outside forever. One piece of paper, one card left with the servant at a front door, and overnight an entire family that money alone could not buy its way into finally belonged. I think what I love most about this story is how it flips everything we just learned about Flora Hastings completely on its head. In England, the rules were used to destroy an innocent woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong. In America, barely a generation later, those same exact rules were turned around and used as a tool quite deliberately by a woman clever enough to understand that a system built on manners could also be manoeuvred like a game of chess. There is a real difference worth noticing between the two countries here, and it says something about the values each side of the ocean actually held underneath all that lace and formality. In England, rank was mostly inherited. A duke was a duke whether he behaved well or terribly, and no amount of cleverness from a family like the Hastings could rewrite bloodlines that stretched back centuries. But in America, where most of that old money was barely 2 generations old itself, status was newer, shakier, and as Alva proved, a good deal more negotiable if you were bold enough and had deep enough pockets to make your move. So here is a question I would love for you to sit with for a moment. If you had been born into that world, do you think you would have played along patiently, waiting your turn, the way the rules demanded? Or would you have been more like Alva, looking for the one clever move nobody else had thought to try? Of course, most people who broke these rules were not nearly so lucky or so calculated. Most etiquette manuals of the time are full of warnings about the ordinary mistakes that quietly ended friendships, without anyone ever raising their voice. Calling too early in the day suggested you were overly eager, almost desperate for company. Calling too late suggested carelessness, as though the visit barely mattered to you at all. Staying too long once you were finally let inside was its own quiet offence too. A proper call was meant to last perhaps 15 minutes, no more, and etiquette writers advised guests to leave the very moment conversation began to feel the slightest bit forced. Bringing along a small child or a dog on a formal call, something plenty of new mothers must have been tempted to do out of sheer practicality, was considered thoughtless since neither one belonged inside a proper drawing-room conversation, but the mistake with the harshest consequences was almost always silence. If a card was left at your home and you simply never returned the visit, you had not committed any crime. You had not said one unkind word to anyone, and yet everybody understood exactly what your silence meant. It was called quite plainly being cut, a polite, wordless, thoroughly devastating way of telling someone they no longer belonged in your circle without ever having to explain yourself to a single living soul. Honestly, does any of this sound completely unfamiliar to you? Think about it for a second. A follow request that never gets accepted. A text that gets marked seen and then quietly ignored for 3 entire days, then completely forgotten. A message that technically was seen and technically was never answered. We like to tell ourselves we've moved on from all of this old-fashioned formality, and in a way we have. Nobody is folding the corner of a business card to announce they dropped it off in person. But the underlying game, deciding who gets a response and who gets silence instead, has honestly not changed nearly as much as we would probably like to admit. We just swapped the silver tray for a little grey check mark. That in the end is really what a calling card was for. It was never simply about good manners or even about being polite for its own sake. It was a quiet, carefully controlled negotiation over who held power in a relationship and who did not, played out entirely through small pieces of paper and the servants who carried them from door to door. Put Flora Hastings and Alva Vanderbilt side by side for a moment, and you start to see the same invisible machine working in two completely different directions. For Flora, that machine crushed a woman who had broken no rule at all, simply because other people were free to imagine the worst. For Alva, that very same machine became a lever, one she pulled with startling precision to lift her entire family out of obscurity in a single evening. The rules never changed between these two stories. Only the hand holding them did, but paper could only give you away for so long. Sometimes it was not what you'd written down or forgotten to write down that betrayed you in front of an entire room. Sometimes it was something much nearer to your own skin, something as ordinary looking as a simple pair of gloves. Let's talk about that pair of gloves for a moment, because there is far more hiding inside them than almost anyone standing in that ballroom ever stopped to consider. Here is something that might surprise you before we even get started. A Victorian lady did not simply own one pair of gloves the way most of us might own one good winter coat. She owned an entire wardrobe of them, tucked into a special drawer or a padded box on her dressing table, each pair waiting for its own particular moment in her day. There were gloves for the morning thinner and paler, meant for short errands near home. There were sturdier gloves for carriage rides, thicker ones for walking, and delicate, almost paper-thin ones reserved only for the dinner table and the ballroom. There were even separate gloves set aside entirely for mourning a detail we will come back to shortly, and gloves in deep black leather worn specifically to church on a Sunday morning. A truly fashionable woman could own a dozen pairs or more, and knowing precisely which pair belonged to which hour of the day was simply part of being taken seriously as a lady at all, and the rule sitting underneath every single one of those gloves was almost shockingly strict. A respectable woman was never under any circumstance to be seen outdoors with bare hands, not on a short walk to the corner, not stepping briefly out to a waiting carriage, not even leaning out a window to speak with a neighbour for a moment or two. One etiquette manual of the era put it about as bluntly as etiquette manuals ever allowed themselves to be, warning that a lady should never appear in the street without gloves, and that the material mattered every bit as much as the act of wearing them at all. Soft kid leather or fine calf skin, yes. Anything made of wool or plain cotton was, in the exact words used at the time, unutterably vulgar, which translated out of Victorian into something nearer to how we would put it today, basically meant everyone will know exactly what you are the moment they see your hands. Think about that phrase for a second, because I think it tells you almost everything you need to know about this entire rule. Not simply unfashionable, not simply a bit plain, vulgar, as though the wrong pair of gloves said something dishonest about the very character of the woman wearing them. Now here comes the part that always makes me sit up a little straighter whenever I come across this particular rule, because it turns out gloves were not just about modesty or warmth, or even about following fashion for its own sake. They were quite literally a way of proving with your own two hands that you never had to use them for actual work. Think about what bare hands usually looked like on a working woman in this period. Chapped skin from cold water and lye soap, small burns from the kitchen fire or the laundry iron, calluses from scrubbing floors from needlework done by candlelight late into the night from any one of 100 small physical tasks that filled the average working day. A pair of smooth, pale, perfectly fitted kid gloves erased all of that instantly. It did not just cover the hands underneath. It silently announced that those hands had never needed covering from labour in the first place, only from the weather, or from the sun, or from nothing more urgent than fashion itself. So here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If gloves like this were the ultimate symbol that a woman never had to work with her hands, who do you suppose actually made them? This is where our story tonight takes a turn I think you are going to find quite moving, so stay with me. Deep in the English countryside, in small towns like Woodstock in Oxfordshire and Worcester, and Yeovil down in Somerset, an entire industry existed almost entirely on the labour of women and girls, quietly stitching together the very gloves that would eventually cover the hands of women who would never once think about who had made them. In Woodstock alone, by the 1800s, nearly 1,500 local women and girls worked as what were called glove-ressers, compared with only around 70 men who handled the heavier work of cutting the leather itself. The stitching, the fine, detailed handwork that made a glove actually fit a human hand instead of hanging on it like a sack that was considered women's work passed down from mother to daughter, often starting as young as 8 or 9 years old, small fingers already trained to work a needle through leather before most of them had learned much else. Picture the actual working conditions for a moment, because I think this is where the story really lands. These women were not working in some grand well-lit factory hall. They were outworkers, meaning bundles of cut leather and thread were delivered straight to their cottages, and the finished gloves, along with payment for the very last batch completed, were collected the same way, often rolled up quietly inside the bundle itself. Some of that work was dusty and uncomfortable in ways you would not necessarily expect. Gloves made for military use, for example, were often rubbed with a fine white clay to keep the leather looking bright and clean, which meant the women stitching them spent entire days breathing in a haze of pale dust inside their own small cottage rooms. A skilled gloveress working from very early in the morning until quite late at night could reasonably expect to finish somewhere around 2 or 3 pairs of gloves in an entire day. And for that full day's labour, she was typically paid somewhere between 4 and 5 pence a pair. The industry itself was not even particularly stable. Back in the 1700s, English glove makers had been protected from foreign competition by strict import taxes. But once those protections were lifted in the 1820s, cheaper gloves from across the Channel came flooding in, and towns like Worcester, which had once employed nearly 30,000 people in the trade, saw that number cut roughly in half within just a single decade. Entire families who had stitched gloves for generations suddenly found the one trade they knew, slipping away beneath them all, while the fashion for wearing gloves among the wealthy only continued to grow. Let that sit for a moment against everything we just talked about. A lady of fashion might own a dozen pairs of gloves without giving the expense a second thought, replacing a pair the moment it grew even slightly worn or fell out of fashion for the season. The woman who had actually sewn each one by candlelight, straining her eyes late into the evening, earned barely enough in an entire day's work to keep her own family fed, let alone to ever own a fine pair of gloves herself. It is worth remembering that the very hands doing this delicate, exhausting stitching were by the standards of the ballroom exactly the kind of hands a lady's gloves were designed to hide. And here is a detail from this world that I find almost unbearably poignant because it is such a small human moment tucked inside a much larger story. In 1851, London hosted the Great Exhibition, an enormous glass palace built specifically to show off the wealth, invention, and industry of the age to millions of visitors. Among the crowds that year was a woman named Elizabeth Money from Woodstock, who travelled down to London not simply to marvel at the spectacle, but to represent her own family's glove-making business. She stood at her own small display showing off delicate lambskin gloves, and fawn-coloured riding gloves meant for elegant ladies inside a building absolutely filled floor to ceiling with the finest luxuries wealth could buy in that era. I keep coming back to that image, honestly. A woman from a glove-making family standing quietly inside the grandest temple to Victorian wealth ever built, surrounded by countesses and duchesses wandering past in gloves that women exactly like her back home in Woodstock had likely stitched together by candlelight for a few pence a pair. I doubt many of those elegant visitors ever thought about her at all. I doubt it even occurred to most of them that there was a woman like her behind every single pair of gloves they owned. Meanwhile, back in the drawing rooms and ballrooms of high society, an entirely different set of glove rules was quietly playing out rules that had absolutely nothing to do with who had made them, and everything to do with performing wealth correctly in front of other wealthy people. At a formal ball, gloves were never optional, not even for a single moment, no matter how warm the room became or how long the dancing continued. One etiquette guide from the period put the rule almost comically, plainly insisting that a lady should never be seen without gloves in a ballroom even for a few moments. And because dancing for hours in warm, crowded rooms tended to leave the first pair looking distinctly worse for wear, damp at the palm, slightly stretched across the fingers, fashionable women who intended to dance frequently were expected to bring along a second pair entirely tucked into a small bag or handed to a maid waiting nearby simply to swap in once the first one grew soiled or damp. Showing up with only one pair and being caught wearing visibly worn gloves partway through the evening was its own small, quiet humiliation whispered about behind fans by women who had of course remembered to bring a spare. Can you imagine planning your entire evening bag around a spare pair of gloves the way we might pack an extra phone charger today? There were rules about removing gloves too, and they were surprisingly specific. At the dinner table, gloves generally came off before eating tucked neatly beside the plate. But on the dance floor, gloves stayed firmly on since bare skin touching a dance partner's hand for an extended rhythmic period was considered a little too intimate for a formal ballroom setting. Getting this backward, removing your gloves to dance, or worse, keeping them on through an entire dinner, marked you instantly as someone who had perhaps not been raised inside these rules from birth, someone new to the room still learning its language by watching everyone else. I want to pause here for a second because I think there is something worth truly sitting with underneath all of this. We have spent this entire story talking about two completely different groups of women, and both of them in their own very different ways were being judged and measured by the exact same object. One group was judged by how correctly, how fashionably, how expensively they wore their gloves. The other group was never even considered part of the conversation at all, despite the fact that without their labour none of it would have existed in the first place. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how many of the objects we consider markers of status today carry a similar hidden story behind them if we ever bothered to look carefully enough. Common mistakes with gloves went well beyond simply forgetting to wear them. Wearing a mismatched or poorly fitted pair, something too loose at the wrist, or straining visibly at the seams, suggested you either could not afford a properly made pair, or did not know how to select one, both equally damning in a world this obsessed with appearances. Wearing gloves clearly showing wear, small stains, a loose seam, a slightly faded colour from repeated cleaning carried the same quiet message as showing up in a dress from several seasons ago. Removing gloves at the wrong moment mattered just as much as wearing the wrong pair in the first place, and a woman who stripped hers off mid-conversation out of simple impatience risked being seen as careless or worse, a little too familiar for the setting she was standing in. And choosing the wrong material for the wrong occasion, something heavier or coarser than the moment called for, could mark a woman as either careless or simply unfamiliar with the countless small rules everyone around her seemed to have absorbed without ever needing to be taught. So here is my honest personal opinion on this whole strange little corner of history, for whatever it happens to be worth to you tonight. I find it almost impossible not to feel for both sides of this story at once. The society women trapped inside a system where a single stained glove could truly damage how seriously people took them, forced their entire lives to revolve around appearances they had not chosen and could not really escape. And the women in Woodstock and Worcester and Yeovil stitching those very gloves by hand for pennies, who will likely never appear in a single history book, a single painted portrait, a single line of anyone's diary. Their names are mostly lost to us now, except for the occasional record like Elizabeth Money's that happened to survive by pure chance because she stood in the right building on the right afternoon in 1851. I do not think this is a story with a villain exactly, at least not one single person you could point a finger at. Nobody woke up and decided to build a system this unequal on purpose. It simply grew slowly out of a society that had already decided a woman's worth could be judged from her hands, and then quietly built an entire economy underneath that belief without ever really examining it. But their work is still there quietly in every museum case full of preserved Victorian gloves, in every painting of a lady posed gracefully with her hands folded just so. We simply do not always think to look for it. That is the strange quiet power etiquette held in this era. It could turn something as small as a piece of stitched leather into a complete unspoken biography of a woman's entire life, her wealth, her leisure, her worth, in the eyes of everyone around her, while erasing almost completely the very different life of the woman who had made it possible in the first place. But gloves as demanding as all of this sounds were nothing at all compared to what happened when someone in a Victorian household actually died. Because grief in this world had its own strict wardrobe too, one that reached far beyond a woman's hands and settled over every single object she owned, sometimes for years at a time. And unlike gloves, there was no quietly slipping a second pair from your bag when the first one failed to meet the moment. Grief in this era was never really allowed to stay a private matter. The moment someone died in a Victorian household, an entire machinery of rules quietly switched on around the people left behind, and that machinery did not particularly care how a person actually felt inside. It only cared about what she wore on the outside and for exactly how long down to the week, sometimes down to the very day. Here is a fact that tends to catch people off guard the first time they hear it. If a woman lost her husband, etiquette did not simply suggest she wear black for a respectful while, and then move along whenever she felt ready. It handed her something nearer to a legal document than a suggestion, a strict calendar-based system broken into distinct stages, each with its own fabric, its own jewellery rules, and its own exact expiration date laid out in etiquette, manuals with the same precision you might expect from a legal contract rather than a guide to feeling sad. The heavier stage was called full mourning, or sometimes deep mourning, and for a widow it lasted a full year and a day, not a single day less. During that time her clothing had to be a matte, completely lightless black, usually trimmed in a stiff, scratchy fabric called crepe, chosen specifically because it had no shine to it whatsoever. Silk was forbidden, satin was forbidden, fur velvet, anything that caught the light and looked remotely luxurious, all forbidden, because looking beautiful while grieving was considered quite bluntly a little bit obscene. As for jewellery, a widow in full mourning was permitted almost nothing except one material, a dense, deep black stone called jet mined, largely along the coast near a town called Whitby, or occasionally a small piece crafted from the actual hair of the person she'd lost, woven into a ring or a locket worn against the skin, as a kind of permanent keepsake. After that first year came second mourning, where the rules loosened just slightly, and then finally half mourning, where a widow was allowed to introduce soft touches of grey, or a dusty shade of purple called mauve, signalling to the world that her grief, while still present, was beginning to soften at the edges. Altogether, a widow's full journey through these stages was expected to last around 2 years. Parents mourning a child or children mourning a parent were expected to observe about 1 year. Siblings roughly 6 months. Aunts, uncles, even distant cousins all had their own carefully measured windows, some as short as a few weeks, each one precisely calibrated to how nearly related you were to the person now in the ground. And there is a wonderfully strange little superstition tucked into all of this that I have to share with you because I think it explains a lot about how seriously this whole system was taken. It was considered bad luck to keep mourning crepe in the house any longer than the prescribed period required, which meant in practice that families could not simply keep a black dress hanging in the closet in case tragedy struck again. Every single time someone died, an entirely new wardrobe had to be built essentially from scratch. The rules did not stop at clothing either. Even a widow's writing paper had to announce her grief. Stationery came edged in black, and etiquette manuals were oddly precise about exactly how wide that border ought to be, thick and heavy, in the earliest rawest stage of loss, then narrowing month by month as her mourning quietly progressed, almost like a visual timer counting down her sorrow, one letter at a time. Wealthier households even extended mourning to their staff dressing servants in black armbands or full mourning livery for as long as the family itself remained in black. Since a household's grief in this world was considered a performance, every single person living under that roof was expected to join. Now stop and think about what that actually meant for the people living through it. Mirrors throughout the house were covered with black cloth, or veiling out of an old folk belief that a wandering spirit might otherwise become trapped inside the glass. Clocks were sometimes stopped at the exact hour of death. Family photographs were quietly turned face down on tables and mantels, and outside on the front door itself families hung a black wreath, or in wealthier households an actual painted shield bearing the family's coat of arms, informing every single passer-by on the street that this particular house was currently in mourning whether they had asked or not. So naturally, where there is this much demand and this many extremely specific rules, nobody dared get wrong. Somebody was always going to build a business around it. In 1841, a man named William Chickle Jay opened a modest little shop on London's Regent Street, dealing at first in nothing more exciting than shawls. Within just a few years, that same shop had transformed into something the Victorians simply called Jay's, a sprawling establishment that eventually swallowed up nearly an entire block of one of London's most fashionable streets. At its peak, Jay's employed something near 600 people, seamstresses, drapers, clerks and travelling dressmakers who could be dispatched by letter or telegram to any household in the country. The very same day, a death occurred, arriving with fabric samples and ready-made garments in tow, because when the rules demanded an entirely new black wardrobe practically overnight, somebody had to be ready to supply it at a moment's notice. Their advertisements promised grieving families they could handle absolutely everything. Dresses, veils, hatbands, even the funeral itself, all conducted, in their own words, without the slightest trouble to the family left behind. Honestly, when you strip away the black crepe and the funeral wreaths for a second, Jay's was doing something remarkably near to what a same-day delivery service does for us today, just built entirely around the business of sorrow instead of convenience. Grief, it turned out, could be scheduled, standardized, and shipped. And there was one customer whose grief did more to fuel this entire industry and reshape an entire nation's relationship with mourning than perhaps any other single person in the whole of the 1800s. On the 14th of December, 1861, Prince Albert, husband to Queen Victoria, died of typhoid fever at Windsor Castle. He was only 42 years old, and the two of them had been married for just over 21 years, a partnership Victoria herself described in letters as filled with genuine devotion. Victoria was by every account utterly shattered by the loss. She reportedly told those around her that he had been killed by the worry and stress of his duties, and in the days that followed she could barely bring herself to function. And here is where her story stops looking like an ordinary widow, following the ordinary rules, and starts looking like something else entirely. She wore black for the rest of her life, not 2 years, not even a decade. The remaining 40 years of her reign, every single day without exception. She kept Albert's rooms exactly as he had left them, with hot water brought in each morning for a shave that would obviously never happen again. His clothes laid out on the bed as though he might still return to change for dinner. She largely withdrew from public life altogether, rarely setting foot in London, avoiding the ceremonial duties her people had always expected to see her perform. The public, sympathetic at first, slowly began referring to her by a nickname that has followed her through history ever since, the Widow of Windsor. Here is the part of this story I think is truly fascinating, and it is the part most people never hear. Queen Victoria's grief did not simply make her a sympathetic figure. It nearly cost her the entire monarchy. As the 1860s rolled into the 1870s, and the Queen remained almost entirely hidden away in Windsor and Balmoral and Osborne House, ordinary citizens grew frustrated with a monarch they essentially never saw. Newspapers began openly questioning what exactly the country was paying for when its own sovereign had all but vanished from public duty. Republican sentiment, the idea that Britain might simply be better off without a monarchy altogether, began spreading in a way it never had during Victoria's earlier, more visible years on the throne. In 1870, with a new republic having just been declared across the water in France, a public rally in London's Trafalgar Square openly called for the Queen's removal. Members of Parliament stood up in the House of Commons and criticised her directly, questioning out loud why the country was still funding a monarch who had all but disappeared from public life. Can you imagine that for a moment a queen so consumed by grief for her husband that the very rules of mourning she had helped popularise across the entire nation nearly toppled the throne she sat on? The turning point came from an unlikely place. In November of 1871, Victoria's own son, the Prince of Wales, fell dangerously ill with typhoid fever, the exact same disease that had killed his father almost precisely 10 years earlier. For weeks, doctors and family members alike deeply feared he would not survive the night, and newspapers across the country printed daily updates on his condition, the entire nation holding its breath alongside the Queen. Victoria, terrified of losing a second member of her family to the very same illness, sat by his bedside for hours at a time, pulled directly out of her seclusion by sheer fear alone. And when her son recovered against fairly grim odds, something in the public mood shifted along with her. On the 27th of February 1872, mother and son rode together through the streets of London in an open carriage past crowds far larger than anyone had expected to a grand Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral. People who had spent years demanding her removal now cheered as she passed. The Republican movement that had been gaining ground for years quietly began to lose its momentum almost overnight. I find something quietly devastating about that whole sequence of events, if I am being honest with you. It took the Queen very nearly losing a second person she loved to finally pull her back out into the world her people had been waiting years to see her return to. There is a real lesson tangled up inside this story, one that goes well beyond black dresses and covered mirrors. The etiquette of mourning was built, at least in theory, to give grief a shape, a structure, a socially acceptable container to be held inside for a reasonable measured amount of time. It told a widow exactly how long she was allowed to feel devastated in public, and exactly when society expected her to quietly begin putting herself back together. But Victoria's own example shows us what happens when that container gets shattered from the inside, when sincere, overwhelming grief refuses to follow even the very rules it helped create. The nation had built an entire industry, an entire etiquette around performing sorrow correctly on a schedule everyone could agree upon in advance. Nobody had quite planned for what would happen if someone grieved too much, too sincerely for too long in front of an audience of millions who depended on her to eventually come back. Isn't it strange to think about that there was apparently a wrong way to grieve even by loving somebody too deeply for too long? The very same society that manufactured black crepe by the mile, that built entire department stores around the business of loss, still expected that loss to eventually politely get out of the way. For ordinary women following these rules, the mistakes tended to be smaller, though the social consequences could still sting plenty. Moving into a lighter fabric before your allotted time had technically expired silk, instead of crepe satin instead of wool, was taken instantly as a sign of either ignorance of the rules, or worse, a lack of real feeling for the person you had lost. Wearing coloured jewellery, anything beyond jet or woven hair during those first heavy months, marked a widow as either careless or suspiciously eager to move on with her life, and returning to society too early, accepting a dinner invitation, attending a concert, being seen laughing a little too freely in public, before the proper months had passed, could quietly brand a woman as cold-hearted for the rest of her social life, regardless of how deeply she had actually loved the person she had lost. Even remarrying, something plenty of young widows with children to support truly needed to consider for practical reasons, carried its own quiet judgment if it happened even a few months sooner than etiquette technically allowed. Here is a question worth turning over in your own mind for a moment. If you had lived through this world, do you think you would have followed every single one of these rules to the letter, out of respect or out of fear of what your neighbours might whisper about you the moment you stepped outside in the wrong shade of grey? My honest opinion, for what it is worth to you tonight, is that there is something almost cruel about turning grief into a performance, this exact, this measurable, this easy to fail at, during what is already one of the hardest moments a person can go through. Losing someone is confusing and messy and rarely follows a tidy calendar, and yet an entire society agreed to pretend otherwise, right down to the width of a mourning border on a sheet of writing paper. And yet I also understand the impulse behind it. When the whole world feels like it has come apart, having a set of clear external rules to follow, rigid as they were, can sometimes feel like the only solid ground left standing under your feet. Perhaps that is the quiet trade Victorian women made without ever really choosing it, exchanging the freedom to grieve, in whatever way they actually felt, for the comfort of knowing exactly what was expected of them next. But not every rule in this world revolved around sorrow. Some of the most dangerous mistakes a woman could make actually happened in the middle of her happiest moments, at a ball across a crowded room, hidden behind something as small and seemingly harmless as a folded fan. Picture a crowded ballroom for a moment, candlelight catching on silk gowns, an orchestra somewhere in the corner, working through its third waltz of the evening, the air thick with perfume, and the low hum of 100 quiet conversations. A young woman lifts a small folded fan up to her right cheek, holding it there for exactly a beat or two before letting her hand drop again. Across the room, a man watching her catches the gesture and understands instantly, without a single word passing between them, that the answer is yes. This is the story almost everyone has heard at some point, whether from a costume drama, a novel, or one of those charming little lists that circulate online every few months. The secret language of the fan, a silent coded system Victorian women supposedly used to communicate with suitors right under the noses of their chaperones. Passed down, we're always told, through generations of clever, restricted women who found a way to speak freely in a world that rarely let them speak at all. It is a wonderful story, truly one of my favourites to come across in all of Victorian history. There is just one small problem with it, and I think once you hear where this whole idea actually came from, you might end up finding the truth almost more interesting than the myth itself, because this supposedly ancient secret language was not ancient at all. It was invented quite deliberately by a business to sell more fans. Let me take you back to Paris to the year 1827, when a man named Jean-Pierre Duvilleroy opened a modest fan-making shop on a fashionable street, not far from the centre of the city. He was skilled, ambitious, and had a genuine talent for turning a simple accessory into something people desperately wanted to own, working with painters and craftsmen to produce fans so fine that European royalty eventually wanted their names attached to his workshop. Within a few decades, his company had become one of the most respected fan makers in all of Europe, eventually earning a prize at the very same great exhibition we talked about earlier tonight, and shortly after that an appointment as official fan supplier to Queen Victoria herself. Jean-Pierre had 2 sons, and the family business split neatly between them. His legitimate son Georges took over the original Paris workshop, continuing the delicate handcrafted tradition their father had built. His other son Jules was sent across the water to open and run a London branch of the family business, right in the heart of England's fashionable shopping district, tasked with winning over an entirely new market of wealthy English customers. And it was Jules, working the London side of things, who noticed something clever already happening in an entirely different corner of the fashion world. Flowers at that time had their own supposed secret language, an entire system where a particular bloom, or the particular way a bouquet was arranged, was said to carry a hidden romantic message. Little printed booklets explaining the language of flowers sold extremely well, tucked into bouquets, and passed between friends like tiny romantic instruction manuals, because who wouldn't want to believe their bouquet was secretly saying something their words never could? Jules looked at that trend, looked at the fans piling up in his own shop waiting to be sold, and had from a purely business standpoint a truly clever idea. If flowers could carry secret meanings and sell twice as fast because of it, why couldn't a fan do exactly the same thing? He printed up his own little pamphlet small enough to slip inside the box with every fan sold from his London shop, practically free to produce and impossible to resist reading. And on those pages he laid out an entire elaborate system of gestures, claiming quite confidently that women had been using these exact signals for centuries to communicate secretly with the men they admired, lending the whole invented system a weight of history it had never actually earned. Touch the fan to your right cheek, the pamphlet claimed, and you were silently saying yes. Touch it to your left cheek instead, and you meant no. Carry it open in your left hand, and you were inviting a stranger to come and speak with you. Draw it slowly across your forehead, and you were warning your admirer that the two of you were currently being watched. Fan yourself slowly, and you were quietly announcing that you were already married. Fan yourself quickly, and you were letting the room know you were engaged. Twirl it in your left hand, and you were signalling that you were being watched by someone else, entirely perhaps a jealous suitor. Draw it through your open palm, and rather less romantically, you were letting a man know you actually hated him. It is a delightful little system, honestly. Whimsical, romantic, and almost cinematic to imagine playing out across a crowded room, one small gesture carrying an entire private conversation nobody else in the room could follow. Try picturing yourself in that ballroom for a moment, half listening to the music, half tracking every fan in the room like a second language you had spent months memorizing. Would you have trusted yourself to get it right, or would you have been the one accidentally announcing you hated a perfectly nice young man simply because you drew your fan through your palm the wrong way at the wrong moment? It also, as far as historians who have actually gone digging through the archives have ever been able to determine, was never something women were reliably using before Jules de Villeroy printed it up and started handing it out with every purchase. There is no real evidence anywhere in the letters, diaries, or private writing of the period that women were quietly signalling romantic intentions to one another, using an agreed-upon fan code. No diary entry describing a near miss caused by a misread gesture. No memoir recalling a mother teaching her daughter the proper technique before her first ball. What does survive in surprising abundance are dozens of these printed pamphlets, produced by fan sellers hoping to move more stock, each one confidently claiming an ancient tradition that mostly seems to have been dreamed up right there in a London shop sometime in the middle of the 1800s, then dressed up with just enough historical flourish to sound like it had always existed. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Why do you think a story like this took hold so easily and held on so tightly when the far less romantic truth was sitting right there the whole time? I have a theory for what it is worth. We tend to want our history to feel a little more magical than it actually was. A secret language quietly passed between women navigating a restrictive world is simply a better story than a fan seller trying to move more inventory before the next fashion season. And honestly, this is not the only time something like this has happened. Think about the modern idea that a diamond ring is the only real way to properly propose marriage, an idea most people assume has existed forever, as though it were carved into the very foundations of romance itself. In reality, it traces back almost entirely to a single, wildly successful advertising campaign launched by a diamond company in the middle of the 20th century, complete with a slogan so effective it convinced generations of couples that a diamond was simply what love was supposed to look like. We are still, it turns out, remarkably easy to convince that a clever sales pitch is actually an ancient custom, as long as it gets repeated often enough by enough confident sources dressed up in just enough nostalgia to feel true. But here is where the story gets truly interesting, because while Jules de Villeroy was busy selling the fantasy of secret fan flirtation, the actual guardians of Victorian manners were doing something nearly the opposite. Real etiquette authorities of the period were not encouraging women to flirt with their fans at all. Quite the reverse. One of the most widely followed etiquette writers of the 1860s, a woman named Florence Hartley, warned her readers directly against exactly this kind of behaviour in her own popular guide to ladylike conduct listing, flirting with a fan in the very same breath as whispering, laughing loudly and clapping your hands together in public, all of it in her own words excessively vulgar and unladylike, the sort of behaviour that instantly marked a woman as something less than a proper lady. Sit with that contradiction for a second, because I think it tells us something important. At the exact same moment a fan company was selling women a romantic fantasy of coded flirtation, the actual etiquette establishment was quietly warning that flirting with your fan in public was one of the more embarrassing things a lady could be caught doing. Two completely different Victorian institutions, one built on commerce, one built on social control, pulling women in two entirely opposite directions with the very same small object resting in their hands. One wanted her to believe the fan was a secret weapon. The other wanted her to believe using it that way would ruin her, and it did not stop with fans either. Once the idea caught on similar pamphlets began appearing for the supposed secret language of the handkerchief, the parasol, even in a few cases the postage stamp on an envelope, Dropping a handkerchief apparently meant something entirely different from dropping a parasol, and tapping your chin with a glove carried its own coded meaning as well. One popular courtship guide of the era practically admitted the whole thing was a fad running slightly out of control, joking that the fashion for secret signals was spreading a little faster than anyone could keep track of. It is worth remembering the next time you hear about the elaborate hidden meaning behind some small Victorian object that an entire cottage industry existed at the time, simply for inventing meanings and printing them attractively enough that people wanted to believe them. So what does this actually tell us about the real danger a Victorian woman faced at a ball once you take away the charming idea of secret coded messages? The honest answer is almost more unsettling than the myth. It was never really about decoding a specific gesture at all. It was about being watched, period, in almost any capacity that drew attention. A woman who fanned herself too energetically risked looking overheated and undignified, as though she could not properly regulate her own body in public. A woman who used her fan too theatrically, snapping it open with a dramatic flourish, or gesturing broadly while she spoke, risked being seen as a flirt, regardless of what any invented pamphlet claimed her specific movements meant. Even the volume of her laugh, or how freely she moved her hands while telling a story, fell under exactly the same quiet scrutiny. The real rule sitting underneath all of it was simply this: do not draw eyes to yourself in a manner that suggests you are performing for an audience, because performing in this world was for actresses, not for respectable women, and the line between the two was watched far more carefully than any fan ever was, which means the actual mistake was never a matter of getting the code wrong. There was no code to get wrong in the first place. The mistake was simply being noticed at all, being animated, being visibly expressive in a room built entirely around the idea that a well-bred woman remained composed, restrained, and quietly unreadable at all times, no matter what she happened to be holding in her hand. My honest opinion watching this whole story unfold is that I find the real version almost more moving than the myth. Not because secret fan signals would not have been a wonderful, quietly rebellious way for women to reclaim a little control in a world that gave them very little of it. I would have loved for that to be true, honestly, and part of me is a little sad reporting otherwise to you tonight. But because the actual truth reveals something else worth noticing, a society so obsessed with appearances that it could simultaneously manufacture a romantic fantasy, for profit sell it back to women as empowerment, and then quietly punish those same women for acting it out in real life, all while somehow expecting nobody to notice the contradiction sitting right in the middle of it. There is also something almost touching about how badly people wanted the fan language to be real both then and now. It speaks to a kind of hope, doesn't it? That even inside the most restrictive social system imaginable, there might have been a clever secret workaround available to the women living inside it. The truth is a little more sobering. Most of these women were not secretly outsmarting the rules with hidden gestures. They were simply learning very carefully exactly how much of themselves they were allowed to show at any given moment, and adjusting themselves accordingly every single day of their lives. Isn't it funny in a slightly uncomfortable way how much of what we now call tradition turns out to have a receipt attached to it somewhere, if you look carefully enough at where the story actually began? I wonder how many other charming little customs we take for granted today will look exactly the same way to somebody 200 years from now once they finally dig up the original advertisement. Fans, gloves, calling cards, even the colour of your morning dress. All of it eventually comes back to the same underlying question, hovering over every single rule we have talked about so far tonight. Who is allowed to be seen how and by whom? A romantic myth about secret gestures makes for a much prettier answer than the real one, which is simply that a Victorian woman was being evaluated quietly and constantly by everyone around her, whether she was holding a fan, a teacup, or nothing at all. And nowhere was that question more tightly enforced, or more quietly dangerous to get wrong than at the single most watched, most scrutinized event in a Victorian woman's entire week, sitting down at somebody else's dinner table. Here's a number that might make you feel a little better about whatever confusion you have ever felt staring down a fancy restaurant menu. At a truly formal Victorian dinner, a single place setting could include as many as 8 different forks, 8 different knives complete with their own resting stands, several spoons of varying sizes, and 7 or more pieces of crystal stemware before a single plate of food had even reached the table. Salt cellars, butter, picks, tiny scissors for cutting grapes, specialized tongs just for asparagus nut picks small enough to look almost decorative, an entire arsenal of tools laid out in a precise, unforgiving order around each plate, and every single guest at that table was expected to simply know instinctively which piece to reach for next, without ever once glancing sideways to see what the person beside them had chosen. Can you imagine sitting down to dinner and realizing the moment the first course arrived that you had absolutely no idea which of the 8 forks in front of you was meant for the fish? Tonight we're pulling up a chair to the most quietly terrifying room in the entire Victorian house. Not the ballroom, not the drawing room where visitors left their calling cards, but the dining room where a single wrong move could ruin your reputation before dessert had even been served. Let's start with something most people get wrong when they picture Victorian dinner parties. You might imagine everything simply laid out on the table at once, a great overwhelming spread of roasted meats and glistening pies for guests to help themselves from passing dishes hand to hand down a crowded table. That was actually the older French style of service, and by the middle of the 1800s, fashionable British households were abandoning it in favour of something new, borrowed from Russian court practice, where each course arrived separately one at a time, served directly onto your plate by a footman standing quietly at your shoulder. It sounds more relaxing in theory, almost like being waited on at a fine restaurant rather than fending for yourself at a crowded table. In practice, it meant guests could no longer simply avoid a dish they did not know how to eat properly or quietly, pass along something intimidating without taking a portion. Whatever arrived on your plate arrived in full view of everyone else at the table, presented and announced, and you were expected to handle it without a single moment of visible hesitation, because a footman was standing right there watching too. Take soup, for example, since it was usually the very first thing served. The rule was startlingly specific. You moved your spoon away from your body as you filled it, never toward yourself. Pulling the spoon inward, scooping the liquid nearer the way a child instinctively might, was considered a small visible sign of greed, as though you could not wait a fraction of a second longer to get the food into your mouth. Something as simple as which direction you moved a spoon, and an entire table of strangers had already begun quietly forming an opinion of your upbringing before you had swallowed a single spoonful. Asparagus brought its own particular anxiety. For much of the century it was considered perfectly correct, even preferred, to eat asparagus with your fingers, rather than a fork using a small pair of silver tongs to lift each spear without touching the food directly with your hand, the theory being that fingers actually handled the delicate stalk far more gracefully than clumsy metal ever could. Guests who reached for the wrong utensil, or worse, tried valiantly to cut asparagus with a knife and fork, the way you might a piece of meat sawing away at it, while everyone else at the table effortlessly lifted theirs by hand, risked a very particular kind of quiet embarrassment, the sense that everyone else at the table already knew something you clearly did not, and were simply too polite to mention it out loud. And here is a detail I think is worth sitting with for a moment. Etiquette books of the era openly acknowledge that guests often panicked over exactly this kind of thing, terrified of using the wrong piece of silverware in front of people whose opinion mattered enormously to their social standing. Which tells you something important. This was never really about the fork itself. It was about whether you had grown up inside this world, or whether you were still learning its rules from the outside one anxious dinner at a time. So who exactly decided all of these rules in the first place? Who sat down and determined that a spoon must move away from you, or that a lady arrives precisely 5 to 15 minutes before the hour stated on her invitation? Never earlier, never later. For an enormous number of Victorian households, the answer to that question had one very specific name attached to it: Mrs. Beeton. Here is where the story takes a turn I find quite touching, so stay with me for a moment. Isabella Mason was born in London in 1836, the oldest of an enormous blended family, 21 siblings in total, once her widowed mother remarried a man with children of his own. She spent much of her childhood at Epsom, where her stepfather managed the racecourse, and where the family often housed the overflow of that huge household inside the grandstand itself on non-racing days. As the eldest girl, Isabella was put in charge of a great deal of the childcare, almost from the moment she could walk, an experience that gave her real hard-earned authority on running a busy household, even if she had not yet earned it through age. She married a young ambitious publisher named Samuel Beeton in her early 20s, and not long after the wedding, following the loss of their first child in infancy, he asked her to start writing a regular column for one of his magazines, largely, if we're being honest about it, to help fill pages on a tight budget and give her something to focus on. What Isabella eventually produced, compiled month by month over several years, and published in installments before being bound into one enormous volume, became Beeton's Book of Household Management, over 1,000 pages covering cooking, cleaning childcare servants, even basic points of law, alongside detailed instructions on exactly how a proper dinner party ought to be conducted from the moment guests arrived to the moment the last course was cleared away. Published as a complete book in 1861, it sold 60,000 copies in its very first year, and very nearly 2 million copies within less than a decade. For generations afterward, when someone in Britain wanted to know the correct way to do almost anything inside a household, they consulted Mrs. Beeton as though she were some permanent, all-knowing fixture of English domestic life, rather than one very specific, very young woman who'd written it all down in a remarkably short window of time. Here is the detail that always stops me in my tracks whenever I think about her. Isabella Beeton was only in her early 20s when she wrote most of this. She had been running her own household for barely a year, and by her own admission buried quietly in the pages of the book itself. Most of the recipes were not even originally hers, gathered instead from earlier cookery writers and from readers of the magazine, then carefully organized, reworded, and presented with the tone of complete, unshakable authority. I do not say that to diminish her, honestly. What Isabella Beeton actually did was arguably harder than simply inventing recipes from scratch. She took a chaotic, scattered body of half-remembered household knowledge, passed down unevenly from cook to cook, household to household, and turned it into something clear, confident and usable. The first cookery writer to consistently list ingredients before instructions, the first to include how long something actually needed to cook, small innovations that sound obvious now but truly changed how an entire nation learned to run a kitchen. That is a genuine skill, a kind of quiet genius for organization that gets far less credit than flashy originality ever does, and it deserves to be recognized as its own form of expertise rather than dismissed simply because she was not standing over the stove herself, testing every single recipe. But there is a real irony sitting underneath her whole story, one I think is worth pointing out gently, because I do not think it is meant as an accusation, so much as an observation about how authority actually gets built. The single most trusted voice on correct behaviour in an entire nation's dining rooms was in practice a woman still learning the rules herself, assembling her authority largely from other people's hard-won experience and presenting it back to the public with a confidence that outpaced her own years of practice. She was in a sense exactly like every anxious young hostess reading her book at the dinner table, quietly figuring it out as she went just one chapter ahead of everyone else in the room and clever enough to make that gap invisible. Isabella never lived to see how enormous her influence would eventually become. She died in February of 1865, only 28 years old, from an infection contracted during the birth of her fourth child, common enough at a time when doctors rarely understood the importance of properly washing their hands between patients. Her husband, deep in his own financial troubles, quietly kept the news of her death out of the papers for as long as he could, continuing to publish new material under her name as though she was still alive and testing recipes in her own kitchen. For decades afterward, readers pictured Mrs. Beeton as an older matronly woman, wise and endlessly experienced. Almost nobody realized the real Isabella Beeton had died before she ever turned 29. Isn't there something quietly haunting about that, the most confident voice in the room turning out to belong to someone who never got the chance to grow old inside the very authority she built? Beyond the specific tools and the specific woman behind the rulebook, there were the social mistakes layered on top of all of it. Seating at a formal dinner followed a strict order of precedence, with the host escorting the most distinguished lady present in first and the hostess entering last on the arm of the most important gentleman in the room, every single pairing calculated in advance according to rank, age and standing. Getting this wrong, seating a guest below their actual social rank or worse, above it in front of everyone else at the table, could cause offence that lingered for months, sometimes ending a friendship over a single miscalculated place card. Conversation had its own quiet restrictions too. Etiquette writers of the period specifically warned against what they called any topic of absorbing interest, meaning anything too intense, too political, too likely to provoke real disagreement, since a dinner table was meant to feel effortless, not like a debate stage where opinions might clash in front of an audience. Wine carried its own small silent language as well. A guest who did not wish to drink simply rested a hand lightly on the rim of the glass as the servant approached with the bottle. No explanation required, no awkward refusal. Spoken aloud, the gesture alone considered perfectly sufficient. And resting your elbows on the table, something so many of us do without a second thought today while chatting with family, was considered one of the clearest, most immediate signals that you had not been properly raised at all. An instant visible mark against you before you'd said a single word. Here is a question worth asking yourself for a moment. If you had been dropped into one of these dinners with absolutely no preparation, how long do you think it would have taken the other guests to figure out you did not belong? My honest opinion, sitting with this whole world for a while, is that the dinner table might have been the single most exhausting stage in the entire Victorian social performance, because unlike a ballroom or a calling card, you could not simply avoid the parts you found difficult. The food kept arriving course after course, whether you knew what to do with it or not. There was no quiet corner to retreat to, no polite excuse to leave early, no way to quietly sit out a dance you were unsure of. You sat there in full view of everyone who mattered to your future for 2, sometimes 3 hours at a stretch, being silently graded the entire time, one forkful at a time, by people who had spent a lifetime learning rules you might only just be encountering. And perhaps that is exactly why a book like Isabella Beeton's became so wildly popular in the first place. It was not really selling recipes, it was selling relief. The promise that if you simply memorized enough pages, you might walk into that dining room and for a few hours at least not feel like the only person in the room still guessing. But dinner, as nerve-wracking as it clearly was, still took place sitting safely in a chair. Some of the most dangerous mistakes a Victorian woman could make happened while she was moving out on an open dance floor in front of an entire room, watching to see exactly who she chose to dance with and how many times. There was a room in London so exclusive that even the man who had just defeated Napoleon could not talk his way through the front door. I want you to sit with that for a moment because it is one of my favourite true stories in this entire era, and it tells you almost everything you need to know about how seriously the ballroom was taken as a battlefield of its own, one with rules every bit as strict as anything fought on an actual field. The Duke of Wellington, war hero, national treasure, the single most celebrated man in Britain at the time, arrived one evening at a set of assembly rooms on King Street in London, wearing trousers instead of the required knee breeches. The doorman took one look at him, glanced down at his legs and quietly refused him entry. He was turned away at the door, not quietly redirected, not given an exception. Out of respect for his service to the country, not even granted the small mercy of being let in just this once. Simply refused and sent back out into the London night to change exactly the same way any unknown young gentleman, fresh from the countryside, would have been treated. The place that dared to turn away a duke was called Almack's, and for nearly half a century it stood as the single most important ballroom in the entire English-speaking world, the place where a young woman's entire future was quite literally decided on a dance floor. Here is how it worked. A small group of women, usually 6 or 7 of them, drawn from the very highest ranks of the aristocracy, controlled every single aspect of who was allowed inside. These women were known as the lady patronesses, and their power had absolutely nothing to do with any official title or government position. It came entirely from the simple fact that everyone in society had collectively agreed to treat their judgment as final. If a patroness approved of your family, you received a small paper voucher granting entry to the Wednesday night balls held throughout the London season, a slip of paper that had to be renewed fresh every single year and could never be handed off to somebody else. If she did not approve, no amount of money, title or pleading could change her mind. Losing a voucher you had already been granted was considered a full-blown social catastrophe, the sort of thing whispered about for months at every dinner table in London. Money alone meant almost nothing here, which surprised people then just as much as it might surprise you now. Families with enormous new fortunes built on trade or industry, rather than inherited land, were routinely turned away at the very same door Wellington once faced, while families with old names and comparatively modest incomes sailed through without a second glance from anyone. What the patronesses were really screening for was something far harder to fake than wealth-breeding behaviour, the particular manner of moving through a room that only years of practice could produce the kind of ease that either belonged to you from birth or gave you away the moment you tried to fake it. The patronesses did not simply stand guard at the entrance and then disappear for the evening either. For a young woman making her very first appearance in society, her opening dance partner at Almack's was often personally selected by one of these same women, a small, almost surgical intervention meant to make sure a debutante's first public impression landed exactly the way it needed to land. And the refreshments served inside once you'd actually made it through the door were by design remarkably plain thin lemonade, weak tea, dry cake, bread and butter. Nothing stronger, nothing indulgent. Almack's was never really trying to compete on hospitality. The entire point of the evening was never the food or the drink. It was simply being seen inside that particular room by that particular crowd, and everyone involved understood that perfectly well. And once you were inside, the real test had only just begun. Almack's dances in the early years were fairly restrained by modern standards, mostly country dances and Scottish reels, everyone moving in structured lines, partners changing regularly, physical contact, brief formal, and constantly interrupted by the pattern of the dance itself. Then, sometime around 1813, a new dance arrived from the continent first among soldiers and diplomats before it ever reached a proper ballroom, and it broke every single one of those comfortable old rules at once. The waltz. Picture the reaction for a moment. Instead of dancers moving in long lines, occasionally touching hands before drifting apart again, a waltzing couple faced each other directly, one hand resting on the other's waist, and stayed locked in that position for the entire length of the dance, spinning continuously around the room, together without ever properly letting go. To modern eyes watching old films or period dramas, it looks almost quaint, practically wholesome. To English society in 1813 it looked scandalous, borderline indecent, the sort of prolonged, sustained physical closeness that had simply never been part of public dancing before, certainly never in front of an entire watching room. One of the loudest critics turned out to be the poet Lord Byron, already one of the most famous, most talked about men in England, who published an anonymous satirical poem that very same year, framing the waltz as a corrupting foreign influence sweeping through English ballrooms, and by extension corrupting English women right along with it. Writing under a fictional country gentleman's name so nobody could trace the poem back to him directly, he described a gentleman's hand freely wandering across a partner's waist in full public view, in a manner it had never previously been permitted to do in polite company, and worried aloud with heavy sarcasm about candlelight shining a little too brightly on dancers standing a little too near one another. It was a remarkably vicious piece of writing dressed up as comedy, and London society devoured every word of it. Here is the detail I find almost too delicious not to share with you. Byron himself, one of the most famous romantic figures of his entire generation, could not actually dance the waltz at all. He had been born with a clubbed foot that caused him to limp noticeably his whole life, and dancing, especially something as physically demanding as the whirling continuous waltz, was simply beyond him. So the loudest moral objection to this scandalous new dance came from a man who, by more than one account from people who knew him, was at least partly motivated by watching everyone else glide across the floor while he stood on the sidelines unable to join in no matter how badly he might have wanted to. Isn't it funny how often moral outrage has a little something personal tangled up inside it, even when the person shouting loudest would never admit that themselves? Despite Byron's mockery and despite plenty of genuine hand-wringing from more conventional moralists who worried the dance would corrupt an entire generation of English daughters, the waltz did not go away. Quite the opposite. Within just a few years it had become the most fashionable dance in London, embraced even by the Prince Regent himself at a ball in 1816, and by the time Queen Victoria's own reign began, it was simply an accepted, unremarkable part of any respectable ball taught to young girls by dancing masters as a basic requirement of polite society, rather than whispered about as something faintly disreputable. What had once been condemned as nearly indecent had within a single generation become completely ordinary, which tells you something worth remembering about scandal in general. Today's outrage has a funny habit of becoming tomorrow's tradition, once enough fashionable people decide to simply ignore whoever happens to be complaining loudest about it. But here is where things stayed truly dangerous for a woman on the dance floor, waltz or otherwise, and this is the part etiquette books were far less willing to laugh about. Dancing with the same partner too many times in a single evening was never treated as a small harmless preference. It was taken by every single person watching from the edges of the room. Mothers' chaperones rival young ladies with nothing better to do than count as something nearer to a public announcement. Somewhere around the third or fourth dance with one particular gentleman in a single night, whispers would begin, glances exchanged across the room, fans lifted just slightly to hide a knowing smile. By the time a fifth dance rolled around, most of the room had already quietly decided an engagement must be imminent, regardless of whether either party had actually discussed any such thing between themselves, regardless of whether it was simply that the music happened to be good and the conversation easy. A woman's own dance card, in other words, could accidentally announce intentions she had never actually formed, simply because she enjoyed one partner's company a little more than etiquette technically allowed her to show, and there was no polite way to undo that impression once the whispering had already started, and refusing a dance carried its own set of quiet landmines. A lady who declined one gentleman's invitation for whatever reason, tired feet, mild dislike, simple bad timing, was then expected to sit out that entire dance, rather than immediately accepting someone else instead. To refuse one man and then be seen dancing with a different one moments later was considered a genuine insult, practically guaranteed to embarrass the first gentleman in front of the very same room that had been watching her dance card all evening anyway, and word of that kind of slight travelled through a social season faster than almost anything else. Etiquette guides of the period actually addressed this exact scenario directly, warning young women in plain language that such a refusal followed by accepting a different partner would be noticed by everyone present and remembered for considerably longer than the evening itself lasted. Even leaving the dance floor came with its own quiet rule. A young unmarried woman did not simply walk off on a gentleman's arm to fetch refreshments or catch her breath between dances. A chaperone, usually an older relative or family friend stationed along the wall for exactly this purpose, was expected to collect her, or at minimum keep careful watch as she crossed the room, because even a few unsupervised minutes moving through a crowded ballroom could plant exactly the kind of quiet suspicion we talked about earlier in this very story back when a simple shared carriage ride cost a young woman everything she had. The ballroom, for all its candlelight and music, was never really a place where a young woman was left alone, not even for the length of time it took to fetch a glass of lemonade. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment. How many silent, unspoken calculations do you think a young woman had to run through her head between every single song, weighing not just whether she wanted to dance, but with whom for how long, and what any of it might look like to the dozens of people quietly keeping count from the edges of the room? My honest opinion watching this whole dance floor economy play out from a comfortable 200-year distance is that it strikes me as almost unbearably exhausting, a kind of constant silent mathematics running underneath what was supposed to be one of the few truly joyful parts of a young woman's week. The music was playing, the candles were lit, the gowns were beautiful, and somewhere underneath all of that beauty, an entire room was quietly keeping score, tallying up dances, cataloguing glances, deciding futures that the two people actually dancing had often not decided for themselves yet. There is something almost touching, too, about the fact that even a war hero like Wellington could not talk his way past the rules governing that same room. It suggests these women, the patronesses, held a kind of authority that had nothing to do with armies or titles, built instead entirely on the shared agreement of an entire social class to take their judgments seriously. No exceptions granted, not even for the man being celebrated in every newspaper in the country that same week. Whether that authority was used wisely or simply wielded for its own sake because it felt good to hold that much quiet power over an entire generation of hopeful young families probably depended entirely on which patroness happened to be standing near the door that particular Wednesday evening. I find myself wondering honestly what it must have felt like to be a young woman standing at the edge of one of those rooms watching the dancers trying to calculate in real time whether accepting this next invitation might say more about her than she actually meant. Do you think you would have kept careful count of your own dances the way everyone else in the room clearly was? Or do you think somewhere around the third waltz, with someone you truly liked, The music might have simply won out over the arithmetic. Getting past the dance floor and the ballroom door, though, was really only the first hurdle for a young woman entering society. There was an even higher stage waiting for her, one single unrepeatable moment, where every single rule we have discussed so far tonight, her posture, her dress, her composure, her ability to move through a crowded room without a single misstep, all had to come together perfectly at once in front of the most important audience in the entire country. Imagine spending 3 entire weeks preparing for a single moment that would last less than a minute. A moment so important that failing it could quietly shut doors. You would spend the rest of your life trying to find another way through. Somewhere in a townhouse bedroom, a young woman is walking backward across a carpet over and over a heavy curtain pinned to her shoulders to stand in for a train she's not even seen yet, practicing a curtsy so deep it nearly touches the floor, rising again without a single wobble, because in a matter of days she'll have to do exactly this in front of the Queen of England with absolutely no opportunity to try again if she gets it wrong. Her mother watches from a chair nearby, occasionally correcting the angle of her chin, the placement of her hands, the exact moment she should begin to rise. A dance instructor hired specifically for this one purpose counts out the timing under his breath again and again until the movement stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like something her body simply knows how to do without thinking. This was presentation at court, and if the London season had a final exam, this was it. Let's start with what actually happened on the day itself, because the ceremony everyone remembers, that brief elegant curtsy in front of the throne, was really only the last few seconds of something far longer and far more grueling. A young woman being presented needed a sponsor, an older woman who had herself already been presented and could personally vouch by her own reputation for the good character of the girl she was bringing forward. Almost always her mother, though occasionally an aunt or a family friend if circumstances required it. That single requirement alone quietly excluded plenty of families from ever attempting a presentation at all, since finding a suitable sponsor was its own small social hurdle, one that assumed a certain level of connection most ordinary households simply did not have. Once secured, sponsor and debutante together arrived at Buckingham Palace by carriage, joining a line of other carriages stretching back down the Mall for what could be hours at a stretch. There they sat, trapped, barely able to move forward, or back, wedged in among dozens of identical carriages, carrying identically nervous young women, while crowds of ordinary Londoners gathered along the route simply to peer in through the windows at the girls inside, treating the whole spectacle as a kind of free entertainment, still hours away from the one moment they had spent weeks preparing for. And once she finally reached the palace itself, the waiting was nowhere near over. Debutantes were packed into overcrowded anterooms, sometimes alongside literally thousands of other guests on the busiest days of the season, elbow to elbow in gowns never designed for crowds with no chairs to sit in, since nobody was permitted to sit in anticipation of the Queen's presence, and no food or refreshment offered, while they waited sometimes for several more hours on top of everything already endured that day. One account from the 1880s, written by someone who had lived through it, described the whole ordeal in fairly unflinching terms, noting that the crush of the crowd was so severe that some young women had their delicate gowns torn simply trying to move through the room, fabric catching on jewellery heels and the trains of the women standing beside them, and that others gave up entirely, retreating in quiet distress because they had never actually managed to reach the Queen at all before she left for the day, her patience understandably having limits that the crowd size did not always respect. Let that sink in for a moment. Weeks of preparation, an expensive custom-made gown, months of family planning and social calculation, and it was entirely possible to walk away having accomplished nothing at all, simply because the crowd that day happened to be too large and the Queen's patience too limited. So who actually made it through, and what happened when she finally did? The dress code alone tells you how seriously this was taken. A young woman's gown needed a train at least 9 feet long trailing out behind her, an enormous, unwieldy length of fabric she had almost certainly never worn before that day, since practicing in the actual dress before the fitting was even finished simply was not possible. Her headdress required a tulle veil, along with 3 white ostrich feathers, worn tilted to one side, an oddly specific detail that had been part of British court dress for generations by that point, and that nobody dared quietly ignore, no matter how impractical it might have felt, balanced on top of an already elaborate hairstyle. White gloves were required, though her right hand needed to come bare at the crucial moment, since etiquette demanded her hand touch the Queen's directly and without a barrier of fabric between them, meaning a small, precisely timed adjustment had to happen in the final seconds before she ever reached the throne. When her name was finally called by the Lord Chamberlain, announced clearly enough for the entire room to hear, she stepped forward, let her train fall and spread out behind her by a waiting attendant stationed there for exactly that purpose, and approached the throne with careful measured steps. There she performed what is often called simply the court curtsy, far lower and far more demanding than any ordinary social curtsy she might have practiced in a drawing-room, bending her knee until it nearly grazed the floor while keeping her back straight and her balance perfectly centered over one foot, all while managing an enormous gown she'd been wearing in most cases for less than an hour. If she was the daughter of a peer, the Queen might lean forward and kiss her on the forehead, a small specific mark of rank visible to every single person watching. If not, she extended her hand instead to be kissed in turn, while the young woman's own bare hand rested lightly beneath it, the entire exchange lasting only a few seconds that had been rehearsed for weeks beforehand. And then came the part that terrified nearly everyone who ever went through it. She could not simply rise, smile, and walk away the way you or I might leave a room after meeting someone important. Turning your back on the sovereign was considered entirely unacceptable, an act of open disrespect toward the crown itself. So instead, after her curtsy, a young woman had to walk backward out of the room, often for a considerable distance, all while managing that same 9-foot train trailing behind her, unable to look down to check her footing, unable to see the door she was aiming for, trusting entirely that she would not catch her heel stumble or step directly onto the very fabric she had spent weeks learning to control. Can you picture that for a moment? An entire room of the most important people in the country, watching in complete silence as you walk backward across an open floor, praying your feet find solid ground with each step, unable to glance down even for a fraction of a second, knowing that a single trip in front of that particular audience would likely be talked about for the rest of the season, if not considerably longer repeated at dinner tables for weeks by people who had not even personally witnessed it themselves. Etiquette manuals of the era spent considerable space on exactly this maneuver, instructing debutantes on how to shift their weight, how to gather their train discreetly against one arm as they retreated, how to keep their expression composed and pleasant, no matter how much concentration the whole exercise actually required underneath that calm surface. There is a phrase from this exact period I think captures the entire spirit of the ritual better than almost anything else I've come across. The poet laureate himself, writing a dedication in honor of the Queen, once described the ideal of a person wearing, in his words, the white flower of a blameless life standing beneath the fierce light that beats upon a throne, a light so unforgiving it blackens even the smallest blot. He was writing about character in general, about the burden of living a public life under constant observation, not specifically about court presentation. But I think it describes exactly what this ceremony was actually testing, whether people realized it in the moment or not. Not simply whether a young woman could curtsy correctly or manage 9 feet of fabric without tripping. Whether her entire life up to that exact moment had remained spotless enough to survive that fierce, unforgiving light being turned directly onto her, even if only for a handful of seconds. Because here is the detail that ties this whole ceremony back to everything else we have talked about tonight. It was not automatic. Simply being wealthy or well-connected or even titled did not guarantee an invitation from the Lord Chamberlain's office. Any real hint of scandal attached to a woman's name, an improper divorce, a public disgrace, a reputation already damaged by exactly the kinds of mistakes we've spent this entire evening discussing, could quietly end her chances of ever being presented at all. No dramatic announcement, no public explanation, simply no invitation ever arrived, and everyone in her social circle understood precisely why, without a single word needing to be said out loud, the silence itself functioning as the verdict. So every single rule we have covered so far tonight, the careful calling cards, the correctly chosen gloves, the properly measured mourning, the dance floor calculations, all of it ultimately fed into this one afternoon. This was the final audit. The moment society checked its own math and decided once and for all whether a young woman's reputation had survived everything asked of it, whether every quiet test she'd passed along the way actually added up to something worth rewarding, with the one thing that mattered most, official, undeniable entry into the world she had been raised her entire life to belong to. Here's something worth asking yourself. If your entire future depended on one nearly impossible physical performance, walking backward across an open room in an outfit you had barely practiced in front of the most powerful woman in the country, do you think the nerves would have gotten to you before you even reached the door? My honest opinion, sitting with this ceremony for a while, is that there is something almost absurd about how much weight society placed on a handful of seconds, a curtsy, a kiss on the hand, a careful walk backward, as though that single performance could somehow prove a lifetime's worth of good character all at once. A person can practice a curtsy for 3 weeks and still be a poor judge of character. A person can trip over their own train and still be perfectly kind, perfectly honest, perfectly worthy of whatever future they were hoping to walk into that day. And yet, in a strange way, that is exactly what makes it feel like the perfect closing chapter to everything we have discussed tonight. Every calling card correctly left, every glove properly chosen, every dance carefully counted. All of it had been building toward this one unbearably public moment, where a young woman either proved she belonged or discovered in front of everyone who mattered that she did not, with absolutely no room left for a second attempt. I keep coming back to how strange it is that a girl could spend her entire childhood being quietly prepared for a performance lasting less than a minute, one she would never be allowed to repeat if it went wrong. Weeks of practice behind closed doors, hours of waiting in a crowded, airless anteroom for 60 seconds of judgment in front of the only audience that ever really mattered. And once it was over, whether it had gone perfectly or not, she simply climbed back into her carriage and went home, technically a different person now in the eyes of society than she had been that same morning, officially permitted to be courted to attend certain events, to be considered at last a woman rather than simply a girl still waiting for her turn. Here is something worth wondering about for a moment. Do you think the relief of finally walking out of that room, whether gracefully or not, ever really matched up to the weeks of dread that came before it? Or is it possible The anticipation of a moment like that is always somehow worse than actually living through it. But even a spotless curtsy, and a reputation that had somehow survived every single rule up to this point, could still be undone by something far smaller and far more ordinary than any of this, something that never required a crowded room or a watching audience at all. A single piece of paper, folded, sealed, and sent to entirely the wrong person, was more than capable of undoing everything a young woman had just spent an entire season proving. In November of 1881, a young woman named Miss Hewson stood in a London courtroom, holding herself together as well as she could, while a barrister recited her private love letters out loud to a room full of complete strangers, every tender word she'd ever written now belonging to the public record. She worked behind the bar at a fashionable restaurant called the Gaiety, which is exactly where she first met a young gentleman named Mr. Truefitt. He came in as a customer, charming, well-spoken, clearly a cut above most of the men who usually crossed her path in that line of work. He courted her properly, or so it seemed at the time. He took a private box for her at the theatre, a genuine luxury for a woman in her position. He walked with her through Kensington Gardens on quiet afternoons, and eventually he asked her to marry him. Even in that moment, by her own account given later in court, she paused and warned him, plainly telling him to consider carefully what he was doing, since she was, in her own words, only a poor girl. He proposed anyway. He even wrote a letter to her father laying out his intentions in writing, mentioning a sum of £2,000 he planned to settle on her once they were married. That letter would later be recited aloud in open court, entered as evidence of private promise, turned into a public exhibit. Then his father found out and made his feelings on the entire arrangement unmistakably clear. "Marry a barmaid," he told his son in no uncertain terms, "and you will never hear from me again," a threat carrying real financial weight for a young man with expensive habits and no independent income of his own. Faced with that ultimatum, young Mr. Truefitt did not simply write a gentle letter, breaking things off the way even a coward might manage under the circumstances. He sent her a photograph of herself that had been deliberately disfigured, defaced in some cruel, pointed way, and mocked her in person at the very restaurant where she worked, in front of her own customers and colleagues, in the one place she could not simply walk away from without losing her livelihood entirely. When Miss Hewson was finally called to the stand to describe what had happened to her, forced to relive the humiliation out loud in front of yet another room full of strangers, she grew faint partway through her testimony, and had to be helped from the courtroom before she could even finish. I want to pause here for a moment because I think this story tells us something important about a part of Victorian life we've not touched on yet tonight, the quiet, permanent danger hiding inside every single letter a woman ever sent. Here is the rule sitting underneath this entire story, one so deeply understood that most etiquette manuals barely needed to spell it out in plain language. An unmarried woman simply did not correspond privately with a man who was not a relative, not unless the two of them were formally engaged. Writing to a gentleman before that point, even something perfectly innocent, a note confirming plans for a family gathering, a brief thank you for a kindness shown, was considered forward borderline improper, the written equivalent of the unchaperoned carriage ride we talked about earlier this evening, the one that cost a young woman everything long before she'd done anything wrong at all. Once an engagement was official, letters were finally permitted, expected, even an accepted part of a proper courtship carried out at a respectable distance. But that permission came with a hidden cost nobody quite warned young women about clearly enough at the time. A letter once written and sent could never actually be taken back. Think about how differently a letter behaves compared to a simple spoken conversation. A conversation fades the moment it ends, remembered differently by each person who took part in it, easy enough to deny reshape, or simply forget with time two people's memories quietly drifting apart from each other over the years until neither version quite matches what actually happened. A letter does none of that. It sits in a drawer, folded and waiting exactly as written for months, for years, ready to be pulled back out and revisited again in precisely the same words, regardless of how much either person's feelings might have changed in the meantime, completely indifferent to how inconvenient its continued existence might eventually become. And in Victorian England, that permanence turned into something with very real legal teeth. Here is a fact that might truly surprise you. In this period, a formal engagement was treated as a legally binding contract every bit as enforceable as an agreement to buy a house or lease a shop. If a man proposed marriage and a woman accepted and he later changed his mind, she could actually take him to court over it, suing him for what was called breach of promise, seeking financial compensation for the damage done to her reputation and her prospects. At the height of this practice during the Victorian era, specifically nearly 100 of these cases made their way through English courts every single year. Here is the detail that always strikes me as particularly telling about this whole system. The reverse almost never happened. A woman could break off an engagement herself for almost any reason at all, with essentially no legal consequence whatsoever, while a man who did the exact same thing risked being dragged into court and having his name printed in every newspaper in London. It was in its own strange way one of the very few places in Victorian law where the odds truly favoured a woman over a man, though I suspect that had rather less to do with fairness and rather more to do with how deeply a broken engagement was assumed to damage a woman's future prospects, specifically in a world where marriage was so often her only real path to financial security. And in nearly every single one of these cases, letters became the single most powerful piece of evidence either side could produce. Think about why, for a moment. A spoken promise of marriage made quietly in a garden or a drawing room comes down to one person's word against another's, easy enough to deny outright once the relationship has gone sour, especially when the two accounts simply contradict each other with no way for a judge to know for certain who was telling the truth. A written promise in a man's own handwriting mentioning marriage, mentioning money, mentioning a future the two of them had planned together in specific dated terms is something else entirely. It cannot be quietly denied in court without the writer looking like an outright liar in front of a judge and jury, his own words sitting right there on the page contradicting whatever new story he was now trying to tell, which meant that every affectionate letter a hopeful young couple exchanged, every small promise scribbled down in a moment of genuine feeling late at night, full of hope about a future neither of them could yet be certain of, was quietly and visibly becoming potential evidence, whether either one of them ever intended it that way or not. This whole phenomenon was so common, so recognizable to ordinary Victorian readers, that Charles Dickens actually built an entire storyline around it. In one of his most beloved novels, a fictional breach of promise trial, in which a widowed landlady sues her lodger, convinced his friendly words over tea amounted to a marriage proposal she had every right to hold him to. Victorian audiences found the whole scene instantly uncomfortably familiar, laughing precisely because cases exactly like it, letters and misunderstandings and all, were being reported in the newspapers on a fairly regular basis, often with just as much genuine heartbreak buried underneath the comedy. Real life and fiction were in this particular corner of Victorian culture walking arm in arm the entire time. There was in fact an entire quiet system built around managing this exact risk before it ever reached a courtroom. Many families, particularly cautious ones, expected to see letters passing between a young couple before they were sent, or at minimum reviewed them once they arrived, treating a daughter's correspondence less as private property and more as a kind of shared family document subject to inspection, by anyone responsible for protecting her reputation. It was not considered an invasion of privacy in the way we might think of it today. It was simply prudent management of a truly dangerous kind of paper, the same instinct that made a family scrutinize a suitor's income or his father's standing before allowing a courtship to continue at all. So here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you knew every single time you wrote something heartfelt to someone you loved, that a parent, a solicitor, or eventually a courtroom full of strangers might one day recite those exact words back to you, do you think you would have written any differently, or would love simply have found a way to say what it needed to say, regardless of who might eventually be listening? Here is where I think the real tragedy of Miss Hewson's story sits underneath all the courtroom drama. She was not trying to trap anyone. She was not scheming for a payout the way popular fiction of the era so often liked to portray women who brought these suits, painting them as calculating and mercenary, rather than truly wronged. By every account of that trial, she truly believed the man courting her warned him honestly about the risk he was taking by choosing her, and only turned to the law after he had humiliated her publicly at her own place of work in front of people she had to keep facing every single day afterward, unable to simply walk away from the source of her income the way he could walk away from an inconvenient engagement. The letters she carried into that courtroom were not weapons she'd been secretly stockpiling for exactly this purpose. They were simply proof of something that had once been sincerely mutually true repurposed out of sheer necessity into a shield, the only kind of protection the law actually offered her. The mistake, if you can even call it that, was never really hers to make. It belonged entirely to a system that offered women almost no protection against a broken promise, except the threat of public humiliation for the man who broke it, and no dignified way to seek even that small measure of justice without exposing her own most private words to the entire world in the process. She had to choose between silent humiliation and public humiliation, and there was simply no version of this story where she walked away with her privacy fully intact. My honest opinion, thinking about this story a while after first learning of it, is that it says something uncomfortable about how little control women actually had over their own narratives in this era, even in the rare moments the law technically stood on their side. Even when she won, even when a jury agreed that Mr. Truefit had wronged her and owed her something for it, the price of that small victory was having her most intimate feelings recited aloud by strangers, dissected, judged, and printed in the next morning's newspaper for anyone in London to pick up over breakfast, alongside their tea and toast. Her private heartbreak turned into public entertainment for people who had never met her. Doesn't that feel strangely familiar in its own way? We like to think we have moved past all of this, and in plenty of real ways we truly have. But think about how often a private message, a text, a screenshot ends up presented as evidence today in a courtroom, in a public argument in the court of public opinion online, stripped of all its original context, and seen by people who were never meant to view it in the first place, forwarded and reposted, until the original feeling behind it has been picked apart into something almost unrecognizable. The paper has changed. The glowing screen has replaced the sealed envelope. But the basic vulnerability, the fact that anything you put in writing might one day be recited back to you by someone determined to use it against you, has honestly not gone anywhere at all. That is the quiet lesson sitting underneath every single love letter exchanged in this era. Words written in a moment of real feeling do not stay contained inside that moment. They outlive it sometimes by decades, waiting patiently to be picked back up and judged all over again by people who were never part of the story to begin with, people who never felt the particular warmth or hope that put those words on the page in the first place, and who will study them anyway with nothing but cold, careful judgment, but letters at least were something a woman had some control over. She chose what to write and to whom, and could in theory simply choose silence instead if she judged the risk too great. There was one entire category of conversation in Victorian society considered so dangerous that women were warned to avoid it altogether in person or on paper, a subject so taboo that even married women sharing a home and a life with their own husbands often had no real idea how much money their own households actually contained. Here is a strange little fact worth sitting with for a moment. In plenty of Victorian marriages, a wife could tell you her husband's exact daily schedule, his favourite meal, the names of every single person in his extended family, and still have absolutely no idea how much money he actually earned or where it went once it left his hands. Money in this world simply was not something you discussed. Not at dinner, not among friends, certainly not between a husband and a wife if the husband happened to prefer it that way, which as it turns out the law of the land was more than happy to let him prefer, with almost no formal mechanism in place to force him to share so much as a single detail if he chose not to. Let's start with the social side of this rule, because on the surface it looks almost quaint. Etiquette writers of the period were remarkably consistent on this point. Discussing your income, your debts, the cost of your home or the profits of your business was considered deeply vulgar, the sort of conversation that instantly marked you as someone who thought about money far too much to be truly comfortable around it, the kind of anxious, calculating energy a properly bred person was simply never supposed to display in public. Even the dearest of friends, women who knew every intimate detail of each other's romantic disappointments and family scandals often had truly no idea what the other actually earned, inherited, or owed. Wealth was meant to be worn quietly through the cut of your dress, the address on your calling card, the quality of your carriage never actually spoken about out loud, as though saying the number itself might somehow cheapen whatever the number represented. But underneath that surface level of politeness sat something far more serious and far less charming, and I think it is worth pulling back the curtain on it properly tonight. A married woman in Victorian England, legally speaking, barely existed as an independent person at all. The moment she said her vows, a legal principle called coverture took hold, and under coverture a wife's entire legal identity was absorbed into her husband's, the two of them treated on paper as a single person, and that single person was in every practical sense him. She could not own property in her own name, she could not sign a contract, she could not open a bank account or keep her own wages if she happened to earn any, or even write a legally binding will, because in the eyes of English law, anything she owned before marriage and anything she earned afterward simply became her husband's. The moment it touched her hands, folded quietly into his estate as though it had always belonged there. Which means the etiquette rule we just talked about, the polite little taboo against discussing money in mixed company, was never really about delicacy of feeling at all. It was protecting a system. If a woman had almost no legal claim to money in the first place, there was quite literally very little for her to discuss. I want to tell you about one woman who found this out in the most painful, most public way imaginable, because her story is the reason several of these laws eventually changed at all. Her name was Caroline Norton, and she was by every account we have remarkably talented. Born into a well-connected but not especially wealthy family, the granddaughter of a famous playwright celebrated from a young age, for her wit and her sharp intelligence, she married a man named George Norton in 1827 at just 19 years old. It was almost from the very beginning a disaster. George drank heavily, grew violent when money ran short, which it frequently did, and Caroline quietly and remarkably turned to writing to help keep the family afloat, publishing poetry and prose that found real genuine success with the reading public. Her poetry and prose sold well. She became, by any reasonable measure, a truly successful author in her own right, respected in literary circles that took very little notice of most women writing at the time. None of that mattered under the law. In 1836, after years of an increasingly miserable and often violent marriage, Caroline finally left George. His response was to accuse her in an enormous, deeply public court case of having an affair with none other than the sitting Prime Minister of England, Lord Melbourne, a family friend she had known for years. The jury found no evidence of any wrongdoing whatsoever, clearing her friend's name entirely. But the accusation alone was enough. Caroline's reputation was shredded in every newspaper in London, regardless of the verdict, her private life dissected by strangers who'd never met her. Exactly the kind of public ruin we've talked about, happening to women throughout this entire story tonight, guilty or not. And then George did something that to modern ears sounds almost unbelievable. He took the children, simply removed them from the household while Caroline was away visiting family, and refused to let her see them at all, perfectly within his legal rights as their father, since English law at the time considered children the property of the man who fathered them, regardless of who had actually raised them day to day. And when Caroline continued earning money from her writing, to survive on her own, George claimed that, too, arguing successfully in court that her literary income legally belonged to him, since a wife's earnings under coverture were never really hers to begin with, no matter how many books she had written entirely on her own. Try to sit with that for a moment. A woman writes a book alone late at night, drawing on nothing but her own imagination and effort. The book sells, and the money it earns automatically becomes her husband's property, whether he lifted a single finger to help write it or not, simply because the law had decided long before she ever picked up a pen that a wife's labour belonged to somebody else. Caroline Norton put the entire situation into words more sharply than I ever could. A married woman in England, she wrote, has no legal existence. Her being is absorbed into that of her husband. In another moment, describing her own circumstances directly, she wrote simply, "I exist and I suffer, but the law denies my existence." Years later, in 1853, George once again refused to pay debts he legally owed on Caroline's behalf, and she found herself dragged into court yet again, this time defending herself directly, since a wife still could not sue in her own name. She fought hard, and by most accounts the courtroom itself seemed to sympathise with her. But the judge ultimately ruled in George's favour anyway, on a small legal technicality that had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with the letter of a law never written with women like her in mind. Her response to that verdict has stayed with historians ever since. "I do not ask for my rights," she said. "I have no rights. I have only wrongs," rather than simply disappearing quietly, which is almost certainly what everyone around her expected. Caroline did something remarkable. She picked up the same pen that had gotten her into this mess in the first place, and used it as a weapon instead. She wrote pamphlet after pamphlet, laying out in careful, precise legal detail exactly how the law failed women like her women, with no rights to their own children, their own money, or their own bodies once they were married. She sent her writing directly to members of Parliament, lobbying anyone with real influence she could reach through old family connections. She wrote a letter addressed personally to Queen Victoria herself, educating the young monarch woman to woman on exactly what English law actually did to women in Caroline's position, regardless of how respectable or accomplished they might otherwise be. Here is a detail I find fascinating and honestly a little bit humbling to sit with. Caroline Norton was not, by her own explicit description, any kind of radical. She once wrote plainly and without apparent irony that the natural position of woman is inferiority to man, and insisted she was not asking for anything so bold as equality between the sexes. She was not fighting to overturn the entire system, or to march alongside the suffrage campaigners who would come a generation later. She was fighting simply to survive inside the system, as it already existed, to keep some small legal claim to her own children, and her own earnings nothing more ambitious than that. And yet, that comparatively modest fight, born entirely out of personal desperation rather than political conviction, ended up reshaping English law in ways far larger than she ever personally claimed to want or even expect. Her campaigning directly led to the Custody of Infants Act in 1839, giving mothers for the first time in English legal history some formal path to petition for access to their own children after a separation. It shaped the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, which finally allowed a woman to keep her own earnings and enter contracts under certain circumstances. Decades of quiet suffering distilled into a handful of specific hard-fought legal clauses. And her writing continued to echo for years afterward, feeding directly into the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, the law that at long last allowed a married woman to legally own property and money in her own name, decades after Caroline had first tried to explain, quite literally begging Parliament to listen, why the current system was destroying women exactly like her one quiet, unrecorded household at a time. I have to say, thinking about her story for a while now, I find something both inspiring and quietly infuriating about it at the same time. Inspiring because a woman with truly modest ambitions for herself managed to move an entire legal system simply by refusing to stay silent about her own suffering, turning her own private humiliation into public testimony that Parliament could not entirely ignore. Infuriating because it took one particular woman being famous enough, articulate enough, and connected enough to force a conversation that should have already been happening on behalf of every ordinary woman, quietly losing her children and her earnings in exactly the same way. Women whose names never made it into a single newspaper, whose suffering left no pamphlet behind, and who simply had to live quietly with a version of the same injustice Caroline fought so publicly to change. Here's something worth turning over in your own mind for a moment. If discussing money was considered so distasteful, so far beneath polite conversation, who do you think actually benefited most from that particular silence, whose interests were truly served by an entire class of women being kept politely, comfortably ignorant of exactly how much control they did or did not have over their own lives? Because that in the end is really the heart of this entire rule. Staying quiet about money did not simply reflect good breeding or delicate feminine sensibilities, the way etiquette manuals like to frame it. It kept an entire class of people, mostly women, from ever fully understanding the very system that controlled their lives, their children and their futures. Ignorance in this specific case was not simply bliss. It was quite deliberately useful to somebody else, and that somebody else was rarely the woman being kept in the dark. That legal reality shaped even the smallest, most everyday moments of Victorian conversation. Etiquette guides warned readers never to ask the price of anything a friend was wearing, never to comment on what a gift must have cost, never to discuss a servant's wages within earshot of anyone at all, since money once spoken aloud apparently had a way of making everyone in the room a little uncomfortable, aware all at once of exactly where they stood relative to everyone else present. A hostess might spend a small fortune on a single evening's entertainment, and every guest in the room would understand instinctively never to acknowledge it directly. To do so would have been seen as either fishing for compliments, or worse, quietly criticizing someone else's more modest circumstances. We have spent this whole evening walking through rule after rule, calling cards, gloves, morning dress, dance floors, court, curtsies, love letters, and now money itself, each one seemingly small on its own, each one somehow reinforcing the exact same underlying idea. A woman's worth, her safety and her entire future depended almost entirely on rules she rarely had any real say in writing herself. But sometimes every single one of these rules collided at once inside a single life, all in the same brutal season. And I think it is time we looked at exactly what that collision actually looked like, through the story of one woman who broke almost every rule we have discussed tonight, some by accident and at least one very much on purpose. Picture an entire jury, 12 serious grown men in formal dress, filing one by one into a fashionable townhouse on a quiet London street, each of them bending down in turn to peer through a single keyhole in a parlour door, murmuring to each other about the angle, the distance, whether a person standing where the door frame met the wall could possibly have seen what was being claimed. They were not there out of curiosity. They were there because a butler had sworn under oath that this exact keyhole was how he witnessed his employer's wife in the arms of another man, and a judge had decided the only fair way to settle the question was to send the jury to see for themselves whether such a thing was even physically possible. 12 grown men crouching one after another to squint through a keyhole in the middle of a fashionable London afternoon, in what remains one of the strangest, most oddly specific scenes in the entire history of English courtrooms. The woman at the centre of that keyhole and of the scandal surrounding it was named Gertrude Blood, and by the time this evening is over, I think you will understand why her story feels like the perfect place to bring together almost everything we've talked about tonight. Gertrude was Irish, clever, strikingly beautiful, fluent in several languages, and by every account of the people who actually knew her, remarkably witty, in a room full of people who valued wit above almost everything else. She could fence, swim and ride as capably as most of the men in her social circle, an accomplishment that made her all the more fascinating to a society that generally preferred its young women decorative rather than athletic. What she did not have was money. Her family held old land in County Clare, but very little actual fortune to offer a suitor, which put her mother in something of a hurry when, during a visit to Scotland in the autumn of 1880, a young nobleman named Lord Colin Campbell took an immediate and obvious interest in her. Lord Colin was the youngest son of the Duke of Argyll, connected by marriage to Queen Victoria's own family. Within 3 days of meeting Gertrude, he had proposed. 3 days. If you remember what we talked about earlier tonight regarding dance cards and how quickly a room could decide a couple was destined for marriage, imagine the whispers and engagement this farce must have generated. But the wedding itself kept getting delayed again and again, month after month, and the reason why should sound familiar by now given everything we have already covered this evening about how little women were actually told about the men they were marrying. Lord Colin had in his family's careful words ongoing health troubles, a phrase vague enough to mean almost anything to outsiders, while meaning something quite specific to everyone actually involved. Gertrude's own father grew suspicious enough to ask quite directly whether his future son-in-law was suffering from a specific kind of illness, one considered far too indelicate to name plainly in polite company, the same unspeakable category of affliction that would eventually shape the rest of Gertrude's own health and happiness. Gertrude's mother, eager for the social elevation this marriage promised, pushed the wedding forward anyway. They married in the summer of 1881. The marriage itself was never properly what a marriage was supposed to be, and within a few years Gertrude had come to believe her husband had knowingly infected her with syphilis before their wedding day. The couple separated in 1884, and in the way these things so often went in this era, separation was really only the opening move. Here is where the law itself, the same law we discussed earlier tonight regarding a married woman's finances, revealed another one of its quiet, deeply unfair asymmetries. Under the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, a husband could divorce his wife on the single ground of adultery alone. A wife seeking a divorce from her husband needed adultery, plus something else, entirely, cruelty, desertion, or a small handful of other aggravating circumstances layered on top. Simple infidelity from a husband, no matter how well documented, was never by itself sufficient grounds for a woman to walk away. So when the case finally reached open court at the end of 1886, Gertrude's side had to argue that her husband's conduct amounted to cruelty, not simply unfaithfulness, a considerably harder case to make in front of a courtroom inclined to believe the worst about an outspoken woman. Lord Colin, meanwhile, accused her outright of adultery, and not with just one man. He named 4 separate men in total a member of one of England's great noble families, who would later become a duke, the head of London's entire fire brigade, whose own daughter had stood as a bridesmaid at Gertrude's wedding, a celebrated soldier and author known across the country for his adventures abroad, and the very physician who had treated them both during their marriage, a man who as a result knew rather more about the state of that marriage than almost anyone else alive. The trial stretched across 18 days, called more than 50 witnesses to the stand, and became by any measure one of the longest and most carefully followed divorce cases in the whole of English legal history, up to that point illustrated daily in the newspapers by artists sketching the key figures for readers hungry for every new detail. And it was here that the household's own butlers took centre stage, testifying that they had personally witnessed Gertrude's supposed encounters with these men, watching by their own sworn account through the keyhole of a parlour door, describing what they claimed to have seen in language detailed enough to make even seasoned barristers pause, which is precisely how an entire jury ended up crouching in a hallway in Cadogan Place, taking turns squinting through that same keyhole, trying to determine whether a servant really could have seen what he claimed to have seen. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because I think it says something almost too perfect about everything we've spent this whole evening discussing. A woman's entire reputation, her marriage, her financial future, all of it hinging quite literally on whether 12 strangers could confirm that a servant's eye pressed against a keyhole had a clear enough line of sight into her private parlour. Not on what had actually happened between 2 consenting adults behind a closed door, on whether the geometry of a hallway made a specific claim physically plausible. Every single thread we have followed tonight comes together in that one image. The servants who were meant to be invisible suddenly holding all the power exactly as we saw when a governess and a lady of the household first carried a rumour to a young queen's ear. The absolute impossibility of privacy even inside your own home echoing that carriage ride that started this whole story. The legal system built almost entirely around a woman's sexual conduct, while barely questioning the men involved at all, a direct descendant of the same coverture that stripped a woman's earnings and her rights the moment she said her vows. And underneath every bit of it, that same relentless, exhausting question that has followed every single woman in every single story we have told tonight. Who is allowed to be seen doing what and by whom? In the end, neither Gertrude nor Lord Colin actually won their case outright. The court denied both petitions for divorce, which meant under the law Gertrude remained legally married to a man she had already left, unable to remarry, unable to fully shut that chapter of her life for the better part of another decade until Lord Colin's own death, from the very disease she always believed he had given her. The unfairness of that outcome did not go entirely unnoticed at the time either. Years later, the case would be cited by the suffragette Christabel Pankhurst as a clear example of exactly the kind of double standard she was fighting against, a legal system that could put a wife's private life on trial for 18 days, while quietly protecting the husband whose own conduct had started the whole affair in the first place. Here is something worth turning over in your own mind for a moment. If the actual legal outcome was in the strictest sense a draw, Why do you suppose Gertrude was the one whose reputation never fully recovered, while Lord Colin largely returned to his previous life relatively unscathed? Because that more than the verdict itself is really the point of this story. Polite society did not turn against Gertrude simply because of what was alleged in that courtroom. Plenty of aristocratic marriages carried far worse secrets than hers, kept safely out of the newspapers, protected by exactly the kind of quiet discretion the entire etiquette system we've discussed tonight was designed to preserve. What Gertrude was truly punished for was breaking that discretion, taking a private ugly marriage and dragging it into open court, into the newspapers, into a jury's careful inspection of a keyhole, was its own kind of unforgivable transgression, regardless of who had actually behaved worse behind closed doors. So here is the twist in Gertrude's story that I think you are going to appreciate, especially after everything we have covered together tonight. She did not fade quietly into disgrace the way society clearly expected her to. She built an entirely new life instead, becoming a truly respected journalist and art critic, writing under her own name, and occasionally under a pen name when the subject called for a bit of discretion. Admired by artists like James McNeill Whistler and writers like George Bernard Shaw for exactly the sharp wit that had once made her so compelling to Lord Colin in the first place. She fenced competitively, winning real recognition in a sport almost nobody expected a woman of her background to take seriously. She swam. She rowed. She lived by every account a full and interesting life on her own terms, in a world that had tried very hard to convince her that her only worth lay in a marriage that had already failed, surrounded by a circle of artists and writers who valued her mind considerably more than the aristocratic drawing rooms that had closed their doors to her. And then in 1893, 7 years after a courtroom picked apart every intimate detail of her private life, Gertrude Blood Lady Colin Campbell published a book. It was called Etiquette of Good Society. I still find myself smiling every time I think about that detail. The woman whose own household staff had spied on her through a keyhole, whose marriage had been dissected by strangers for 18 straight days, in front of a packed courtroom whose name had been dragged through every newspaper in London, and sketched by illustrators for readers who had never met her, sat down and wrote the definitive guide to proper behaviour in polite company, complete chapters on weddings, balls, dinners, and christenings, dispensing exactly the kind of advice that society itself had failed to extend to her when she needed it most. The book covered in careful, confident detail precisely the world that had spent an entire fortnight in 1886 deciding she did not belong in it. My honest opinion, thinking about Gertrude's whole story from beginning to end, is that there is something almost defiant hidden inside that book, whether she intended it that way or not. A woman's society had tried to erase writing the very rule book that society claimed to live by, essentially saying, without ever needing to say it directly, that she understood these rules better than any of them ever had, and that understanding them had never been the thing that saved her in the first place. Knowing the rules perfectly had not protected her from a keyhole or from a courtroom or from a husband determined to ruin her. The rules were never really designed to protect the woman following them. They are designed to protect everyone else's comfort, instead the comfort of a society that needed to believe its own carefully maintained order actually meant something. I keep coming back to the fact that she chose to write about etiquette specifically out of every possible subject available to a talented journalist with a sharp pen, and a story the whole country already knew. Not a memoir settling scores, not a novel thinly disguising her own experience. A calm, confident, almost cheerful manual on how to behave correctly at a wedding or a dinner party, or a funeral written by the one woman in England everyone assumed had failed at exactly that. We have spent this whole night walking through rule after rule that Victorian women were expected to follow perfectly quietly and without complaint, each one promising in its own way that following it correctly would keep a woman safe. Gertrude Blood's story is the clearest proof I have found that the promise was never entirely true. You could follow every rule you knew and still end up with an entire jury bent over a keyhole deciding your fate in a story that was never really about you at all. So now, with every single one of these stories sitting behind us, I think it is finally time to step back and ask what all of this actually adds up to, and what, if anything, it still has to say to us tonight. So what does it all add up to? I've been sitting with that question the entire time we've been together tonight, and I think the honest answer is smaller and somehow sadder than any single one of the stories we just walked through. Every rule we covered: the carriage ride, the calling card, the glove stitch by hands that could never afford to wear one, the black dress worn for exactly the correct number of months, the fan that turned out to hold no real secret language at all, the dinner table crowded with more forks than any one person could reasonably need, the dance floor where every single partner was quietly counted the curtsy that could not fail the letter that outlived the love behind it, the money nobody was allowed to mention, and finally that one impossible keyhole was never really a separate rule at all. They were all the exact same rule, wearing a different costume each time. Here is that rule stripped all the way down to its bones. A woman's worth was never actually measured by her own character, her own kindness, her own intelligence, or her own choices. It was measured entirely by how she appeared to other people in any given moment, whether or not she had any real control over that appearance at all. Think back for a moment to where we started tonight with Flora Hastings, a woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong, sharing a carriage out of pure practicality on a long cold road home. She was not punished for a choice. She was punished for how that choice might have looked to somebody watching from a distance, somebody who had already decided long before they had any actual evidence exactly what story they wanted to believe. She died still trying to clear her own name, having broken no rule at all except the rule of being seen in the wrong place at the wrong time next to the wrong man. And by the very end of the night, we watched that same principle play out one final time inside an actual courtroom, where 12 grown men took turns bending down to look through a keyhole, not to determine what had truly happened behind a closed door, but simply to determine what somebody standing in that exact spot could have plausibly claimed to see. From a quiet country road to a formal London courtroom, the entire distance between those two moments, and the whole of a woman's life could still come down to the same brutal math. Not what actually happened, what it looked like from the outside, and in between those two moments sat all the rest of it. A queen who mourned so completely, so publicly for so many years that her own grief nearly cost her the throne, while somewhere out in the countryside other women stitched the very gloves that hid the hands of the ladies who could afford to wear them. A young debutante practicing how to walk backward across a carpet for weeks, terrified of tripping in front of the one audience that could decide her entire future in under a minute. An entire romantic mythology about secret fan signals built not by generations of clever women passing down a private language, but by one enterprising shop owner trying to sell a few more fans before the season ended. Every single one of these stories on the surface looks like it is about something different. A dress, a dance, a piece of paper. But scratch just slightly beneath any of them, and you find the exact same question waiting underneath. Who gets to decide what a woman's actions mean, and how much say did she ever actually have in that decision herself? I think that is the real uncomfortable thread running underneath everything we have covered tonight. These rules were never really about manners at all, no matter how the etiquette books like to dress them up in language about grace, refinement, and good breeding. They were a system for managing observation, for deciding in advance exactly how much of a woman's life the public was allowed to witness, and exactly how she would be judged for every single detail of it, fairly or not. And here is the part I find myself circling back to again and again long after finishing my research for tonight. So many of the women in these stories were not actually breaking any of these rules on purpose. Flora Hastings followed every rule she knew, and it still cost her everything. Isabella Beeton simply wrote down what she had learned from other women's kitchens, presented with more confidence than her own age, technically earned her, and became the most trusted domestic voice in an entire nation almost by accident. Caroline Norton was not fighting for some grand political cause when she first picked up her pen. She was fighting to see her own children again, and Gertrude Blood never wanted a courtroom, a keyhole, or a single one of those 18 days in front of a packed gallery of strangers. She simply wanted a marriage that did not nearly kill her. None of them set out to become symbols of anything. They were simply trying to survive inside a set of rules that had been written in every meaningful sense, without ever actually asking them what they needed. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment wherever you happen to be listening tonight. How many of the rules shaping your own life right now, the ones that feel so obvious you have honestly stopped noticing them at all, were ever actually written with people like you in mind, rather than simply inherited unquestioned from whoever happened to be holding the pen 100 years before you were born? Because I do not think this story is nearly as safely tucked away in the past as it might feel at first listen. We like to imagine we've left all of this behind us, the calling cards, the gloves, the carefully counted dances, and in plenty of very real ways we absolutely have. Nobody is checking whether you folded a corner correctly on a piece of paper before ringing your own doorbell. Nobody is counting how many times you danced with the same person at a wedding, waiting to whisper about what it might mean. But think honestly about how much of your own daily life still gets quietly filtered through the exact same question these women wrestled with every single day of theirs. Not, is this actually who I am? Simply, how will this look to whoever happens to be watching? A photograph taken from slightly the wrong angle at slightly the wrong moment, stripped of every bit of context and suddenly circulating far beyond anyone's control. A private conversation screenshotted and shared, reduced to a handful of careless words that never meant what they now appear to mean, seen by strangers who will never once ask for the full story before forming an opinion. An entire complicated personality boiled down to a single clip online, viewed by millions of people who will never actually meet the person behind it, deciding often within seconds exactly what kind of person they must be. We simply swapped the ballroom for a feed, the keyhole for a comment section, and kept right on measuring each other by appearances rather than character, just with considerably more people watching considerably faster and considerably less mercy than even the harshest Victorian drawing room ever managed. I do not say any of that to leave you feeling hopeless tonight, especially not this near to sleep. I say it because I think there is something truly worth taking from every single woman we met tonight, and it is not simply that their world was unfair, though it clearly undeniably was. It is that again and again, in ways both large and small, they found some way to keep living fully anyway, inside a system that was never built to make that easy for them. Alva Vanderbilt looked at a set of rules designed specifically to keep her out, studied them carefully, and used those exact same rules to force her way through the front door, regardless, turning a system built to exclude her family into the very tool that finally let them in. Isabella Beeton took the scattered, half-remembered knowledge of countless other women cooks and mothers and housekeepers whose name's history never bothered to record and turned it into something so useful it outlived her by more than a century long after the young woman who actually wrote it had been quietly, deliberately hidden from the very readers who trusted her name. Caroline Norton picked up the very pen that had once been used to strip away her rights, and used it instead to help rewrite the law itself, turning her own private devastation into protection for women she would never personally meet. And Gertrude Blood, after watching her most private moments picked apart by an entire courtroom, still found her way back to a full, rich life of her own, choosing surrounded by people who valued her mind more than her marital status, eventually even writing the rulebook society had once used to try to exclude her. None of them broke the entire system single-handedly. I do not want to oversell that to you because it simply would not be honest. The rules we talked about tonight did not disappear because one woman wrote a clever pamphlet, or because another one refused to stay quietly disgraced. Most of these rules lingered on for decades after every single woman in tonight's stories had passed away, slowly worn down. Instead, by generations of ordinary women, none of us will ever know the names of each one, chipping away just a little more than the woman before her. But every single one of the women we met tonight found some small specific crack in the system anyway, some quiet space where a little more freedom was possible than the rules technically allowed, and they pushed themselves through it one at a time without waiting for permission that was never going to arrive on its own. Maybe that in the end is the real lesson sitting underneath everything we've talked about together tonight. Not that the rules were fair, because they clearly were not by any reasonable modern standard, but that a person's worth was never actually determined by how well she managed to follow them in the first place. It was determined by everything she quietly became in spite of them, whether the watching world of her own time ever fully recognized that or not, and whether history remembered her name or simply let it quietly disappear into the record alongside thousands of others just like her. I keep coming back to something particular about Gertrude Blood's story, especially out of everyone we met tonight. That she chose of all the paths open to her afterward to write a book about etiquette. Not to condemn the whole idea of manners and grace, but simply to prove quietly, and without ever needing to say it outright, that she had mastered every single rule society claimed to value, and that mastering those rules had never been the thing that determined her worth as a person to begin with. I think there is something almost gentle in that choice, honestly. Not bitter, not angry, simply unmistakably hers. So before we wrap things up for tonight, I want to say thank you sincerely for spending this time with me, walking through 10 different worlds inside one long, complicated century, sitting with women whose names most of us were never taught in school, but whose stories I think still have something real left to teach us even now, especially now. If you made it all the way to this point wherever you are, no matter how late it has gotten, wherever you happen to be listening from, that patience means something to me, and I do not take it for granted. If tonight's journey kept you company, if it gave you something to think about as you finally shut your eyes, I would love to hear which story stayed with you the longest down in the comments, whenever you get the chance, whether it was Flora Hastings in her carriage, Alva Vanderbilt at her own front door, or Gertrude Blood sitting down years later to write the very rule book that once tried to write her out of polite society entirely. And if you enjoyed drifting through this particular corner of history with me tonight, a like on this video and a subscribe quietly tucked in for later helps far more than you might imagine letting me know. It is worth building another one of these evenings together, because there are so many more of these quiet, tangled corners of history still waiting for us. More rules nobody ever fully explained. More women whose names deserve to be spoken a little louder than history originally allowed, whose letters and diaries and court testimonies are still sitting quietly in archives, waiting for someone to dust them off and speak them out loud again. So rest well tonight. Let these stories settle, gently, somewhere in the back of your mind, the carriage, the calling card, the keyhole. And I will see you again soon for another story, another world, another evening spent together in the dark, learning just how much history still has left to whisper to us if we simply take the time to slow down and listen. Wherever you are tonight, I hope this gave you exactly what you came looking for, whether that was a bit of company, a bit of curiosity, or simply something gentle enough to carry you off to sleep. Thank you again for staying with me through all of it. Sleep well. I will see you next time.